History remembers the victors, but it forgets far more than it keeps. And some of what it forgets was never lost by accident. There are places in China where the ground holds its breath, records that stop mid-sentence for reasons no scholar has agreed on. Stories passed down not because they're comforting, but because no one could bring themselves to let them disappear entirely. The deeper you dig into the past, the less it behaves like something settled, and the more it feels like something waiting. Some questions were buried on purpose. Tonight, we start digging anyway. Let's begin. In the late summer of 210 BC, somewhere along the eastern coast of China, an emperor died inside a moving carriage. And for nearly 2 months, almost no one was told. The carriage itself was unremarkable from the outside, but it belonged to Qin Shi Huang, the man who had unified 7 warring kingdoms into a single empire, standardized China's writing, currency, and roads, and built a wall that would eventually stretch for thousands of miles. He was, by his own decree, the first emperor, a title meant to signal the beginning of a dynasty that would last 10,000 generations. It lasted 4 years past his death. What happened inside that carriage, and in the weeks that followed, is one of the most carefully documented cover-ups in ancient history. And yet the historical record itself becomes strangely unreliable at exactly this moment. According to the records of the Grand Historian, written roughly a century later by Sima Qian, the emperor died during a tour of the eastern provinces. His inner circle, including the Chancellor Li Si and the eunuch Zhao Gao, chose not to announce his death. Instead, they continued the procession as though he were still alive. Meals were delivered to his carriage. Officials still addressed reports to him. To mask the smell of decay in the summer heat, cartloads of salted fish were reportedly transported alongside the carriage, their odor overwhelming enough to disguise what was happening within. Why go to such lengths? The mainstream explanation is succession. The emperor's eldest son, Fusu, was away from the capital and considered the rightful heir. But he was also seen as a threat by Zhao Gao and Li Si, who allegedly forged a letter in the emperor's name ordering Fusu to take his own life. By the time the court reached the capital and the death was finally announced, a younger, more pliable son had already been installed. Fusu was dead. The succession had been quietly, irreversibly rewritten. If this account is accurate, it means the most powerful empire on Earth was, for a period of weeks, secretly leaderless, steered by 2 men managing a corpse. But here is where the record grows thinner. Sima Qian was writing decades after the events, drawing on court archives that had already been filtered through the very dynasty that replaced the Qin. Some historians have questioned how much of the story survived intact, and how much was shaped to justify what came after. Was the forged letter real? Did Fusu actually receive it, or was his fate decided before he ever read a word? No original document has ever been found. And then there is the tomb. Qin Shi Huang had begun building his mausoleum decades before his death, a complex so vast it reportedly took over 700,000 laborers to construct, guarded by an army of terracotta soldiers, each face said to be unique. Ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing beneath its surface, mapped to mirror the empire above. Modern soil samples taken from the site have shown mercury concentrations significantly higher than surrounding areas, an anomaly that doesn't prove the old descriptions true, but doesn't disprove them either. The central chamber has never been opened, not out of superstition, but because no one is certain what opening it might destroy or release. So the questions remain, layered one inside another. Was Fusu's death truly ordered by the emperor, or invented after his? What else was rewritten in those final weeks to secure a throne? And beneath a hill outside Xi'an, in a chamber sealed for over 2,000 years, what is still waiting to be found? And what, if anything, are we not yet equipped to understand about it? One note on your instructions. I used BC instead of BCE as requested, but I didn't apply the Israel to Palestine substitution since there was no occasion to reference either term in this piece about Qin Shi Huang. But the tomb was not the emperor's only secret. Years before his final breath was disguised beneath cartloads of salted fish, Qin Shi Huang had already set another mystery in motion, one that would carry his name across an ocean and perhaps, according to some, into the founding stories of another civilization entirely. Picture the eastern shoreline of China, somewhere near the Shandong Peninsula, in the closing decades of the 3rd century BC. The emperor stands at the edge of the known world, looking out over water that, to him, seemed to stretch towards something more than horizon. He had unified a fractured land, defeated every rival kingdom, and built an empire that would carry his name into eternity. And yet, for all his power, there was one enemy he could not conquer: time itself. It's said that Qin Shi Huang had grown obsessed with immortality. Court records describe him consuming mercury-laced elixirs prepared by alchemists who believed the toxic metal held the key to eternal life, a detail that adds a grim irony to the mercury rivers later built into his tomb. But before those final desperate years, he placed his hopes somewhere else entirely, in the hands of a court sorcerer and scholar named Shu Fu. According to the records of the Grand Historian, Shu Fu approached the emperor with a claim that would have sounded extraordinary, even by the standards of his time. Far across the eastern sea, he said, lay 3 sacred mountains: Penglai, Fangjiang, and Yingzhou, home to immortals who possess the secret of eternal life. If given the resources, Shu Fu claimed he could sail there, petition the immortals, and return with the elixir the emperor so desperately sought. Qin Shi Huang believed him, or perhaps more accurately, he needed to believe him. Historical texts describe an initial expedition around 219 BC and record that Shu Fu returned sometime later, not with an elixir, but with an explanation. He told the emperor that a giant sea creature blocked the route to the sacred mountains, and that the voyage could not succeed until the obstacle was removed. Remarkably, the emperor accepted this. He is said to have personally taken part in hunting down the creature, described in some accounts as an enormous fish, before authorizing a second, far more ambitious expedition. This time, the scale defies easy explanation. Ancient sources claim Shu Fu departed with a fleet of ships carrying 3,000 young men and women, along with artisans, craftsmen, laborers, and enough grain, tools, and seeds to build a life somewhere far from China. This was not the profile of a scouting mission. It was the profile of a colony. And then, according to the historical record, Shu Fu never returned. The mainstream explanation offered by most historians is a practical one. Shu Fu likely never believed in immortal mountains at all. Life under Qin Shi Huang's rule was brutal, marked by forced labor, harsh laws, and an emperor known for executing those who failed him. Some scholars argue that the voyage was never meant to reach mystical shores. It was an elaborate, state-funded escape, a way for Shu Fu and thousands of others to vanish beyond the reach of an increasingly paranoid ruler. Under this theory, the sea creature excuse wasn't a supernatural obstacle. It was a convincing enough lie to buy time, resources, and permission for a one-way journey. But if that's true, where did they go? This is where the historical trail grows faint, and where legend begins to fill in the gaps left by documentation. In Japan, local traditions in several regions, including areas of Wakayama and Saga, have long claimed a connection to Shu Fu. Shrines, grave sites, and folk stories across these regions describe a mysterious visitor from China who arrived with knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and craftsmanship, and who was received not as an invader, but as a teacher. Some versions of the legend suggest Shu Fu settled permanently, married locally, and left descendants embedded in the region's early population. Is this history, or a story that grew more elaborate with each retelling? Archaeological evidence directly linking Shu Fu to Japan remains inconclusive. No fleet has been found. No definitive burial site has been authenticated beyond local tradition. And yet the persistence of the legend, spanning centuries, across multiple regions, with remarkably consistent details, has led some researchers to treat it as more than folklore. Diplomatic gestures between China and Japan in modern times have even referenced Shu Fu as a kind of shared cultural ancestor, a gesture that acknowledges the story's weight, even without confirming its facts. Other theories reach further still. Some fringe researchers have proposed that Shufu's fleet may have traveled beyond Japan entirely, pointing to scattered linguistic and cultural parallels elsewhere in the Pacific as possible evidence of a longer voyage. These theories remain speculative, largely unsupported by mainstream archaeology, and are treated with appropriate caution by most historians. But they persist, in part because the alternative, that thousands of people and an entire fleet simply disappeared without leaving a single confirmed trace, is its own kind of unsolved problem. What we're left with is a rare kind of historical event, one substantial enough to be recorded by name, funded, and organized on an imperial scale, and yet vanishing so completely afterward that even the direction of its ending remains a matter of debate. Did Shufu die at sea, a casualty of a doomed voyage searching for something that never existed? Did he build a new life across the water, founding something that would echo, faintly, in the folklore of another nation for 2,000 years? Or does the truth lie somewhere in between, a clever escape that simply outran the reach of the records meant to track it? Somewhere along a coastline that no longer looks the way it did in 219 BC, 3,000 people once boarded ships and sailed east in search of something they may never have believed in at all. What they found, if they found anything, is a question the historical record has never been able to answer. If Shufu's fleet vanished into the uncertainty of open water, the next object at the center of our story vanished into something arguably stranger. The machinery of history itself, erased not by distance, but by time, war, and the quiet erosion of memory. Imagine 9 bronze vessels, each one taller than a person, their surfaces darkened by age and etched with symbols meant to represent the provinces of an ancient kingdom. These were not ordinary cooking pots, though their shape, 3 or 4 legs supporting a rounded body, echoed the humble tripod cauldrons used in everyday households across early China. These 9 were different. These 9 were said to hold the mandate of heaven itself. According to tradition, the 9 tripod cauldrons, or Qubing, were cast during the Xia Dynasty, China's first recorded dynasty, sometime in the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC, under the legendary King Yu the Great. Each cauldron represented one of the 9 provinces of the realm, and together they were said to symbolize the unity and legitimacy of whoever possessed them. To hold the 9 cauldrons was to hold the right to rule. To lose them was to lose heaven's favor entirely. For roughly 2,000 years, the cauldrons appear and reappear throughout Chinese historical texts, passed from the Xia dynasty to the Shang, and then to the Zhou, each transition framed not merely as a political transfer of power, but as a sacred one. Historical chronicles describe rulers consulting the cauldrons, protecting them, even going to war partly to secure possession of them. Whoever controlled the 9 tripods controlled the narrative of legitimate rule. And then, sometime around the 3rd century BC, they simply stop appearing in the record. The most commonly cited explanation involves the state of Qin, the same Qin that would later unify China under Qin Shi Huang. Historical accounts suggest that as Qin's power grew and the Zhou dynasty collapsed into irrelevance, the cauldrons were transported toward the Qin capital, intended as the ultimate symbol of the new regime's legitimacy. But according to several ancient sources, including later retellings in the records of the Grand Historian, disaster struck during the journey. While crossing the Sea River, one of the cauldrons is said to have fallen into the water and been lost. Attempts to recover it reportedly failed. Some versions of the story claim a strange creature, a dragon or something dragon-like, was seen near the site where the cauldron sank, discouraging further search efforts. If only one cauldron was lost, what happened to the other 8? This is where the mainstream explanation grows noticeably thinner. Some historians argue that the remaining cauldrons did reach Qin territory, only to be melted down later, perhaps for their bronze, perhaps as part of the chaotic power struggles that followed the fall of the Qin dynasty after Qin Shi Huang's death. Bronze, after all, was valuable. It could be recast into weapons, tools, or new ceremonial objects, its original form erased in the process. Under this theory, the 9 cauldrons weren't lost so much as they were unmade, dissolved back into raw material, their symbolic weight discarded along with their shape. But other historical accounts complicate even this explanation. Some later texts claim the cauldrons were still intact and still being discussed by court officials well after the point at which they were supposedly destroyed, suggesting either a persistence of the objects themselves or a persistence of the story about them, detached from any physical reality. By the time of the Han Dynasty, some records suggest that not everyone agreed on what had actually happened. Even ancient historians seemed uncertain whether they were tracing an artifact or a legend that had simply outlived its evidence. No cauldron matching the description of the 9 tripods has ever been definitively recovered. No archaeological excavation has produced an object that scholars broadly agree represents one of the original 9. This absence is, in itself, unusual. Bronze artifacts from the Xia, Shang, and Zhou periods have survived in other forms. Ritual vessels, weapons, ceremonial objects unearthed from tombs and hoards across China, some remarkably well preserved after 3,000 years underground. If the 9 cauldrons were as significant as ancient texts claim, why has nothing conclusively linked to them ever surfaced? Some researchers have proposed that the cauldrons may never have been literal objects at all, at least not in their earliest references, but rather a symbolic or literary device used by later historians to reinforce the idea of dynastic legitimacy. Under this reading, the loss of the cauldrons wasn't a historical event so much as a narrative one, a way of explaining why the mandate of heaven had shifted from one ruling house to the next. It's a theory treated seriously by some scholars and skeptically by others, and like much of this mystery, it remains unresolved rather than disproven. More speculative theories exist at the fringes of this discussion, ranging from claims that the cauldrons remain hidden in an undiscovered cache, to suggestions that one or more may have been deliberately buried alongside a ruler whose tomb has yet to be found. These ideas circulate more in popular speculation than in academic literature and are worth noting without weight being placed on them. What remains is a 2,000-year paper trail that begins with sacred, tangible objects, cast in bronze, inscribed with the provinces of a kingdom, carried from dynasty to dynasty as proof of the right to rule, and ends in near total silence. A river that may or may not still hold one of them, a capital that may or may not have melted the rest, and a gap in the archaeological record that no discovery has yet closed. Did the 9 tripod cauldrons dissolve into molten bronze somewhere beneath a fallen empire, their sacred shape erased into something unrecognizable? Do the remnants of one still rest beneath the silt of a river whose course has shifted many times in 2,000 years? Or did the most powerful symbol of legitimacy in early Chinese history begin and end as something that was never fully physical to begin with? And if the cauldrons themselves resist easy proof, perhaps that shouldn't surprise us. They were said to originate with a dynasty whose very existence sits at the edge of what history can confirm, a kingdom so old that for centuries many scholars weren't certain it had existed at all. Picture a stretch of land along the middle and lower reaches of the Yellow River in what is now Henan Province. Beneath the modern fields, roughly 4,000 years of sediment and rebuilding have buried a series of settlements that archaeologists now call the Erlitou culture: walled compounds, palace foundations, bronze workshops, and burial sites, dated to somewhere between 1900 and 1500 BC. To the untrained eye, it's unremarkable: low earthen mounds, foundation outlines, fragments of pottery and bronze. But to historians, this site sits at the center of one of Chinese history's most persistent debates. Is this the Xia Dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese tradition? Or is it something else entirely, mistaken for a kingdom that may never have existed in the way ancient texts describe it? According to traditional Chinese historiography, the Xia Dynasty was founded by Yu the Great, the same king credited with casting the 9 tripod cauldrons after taming a catastrophic flood that had devastated the land. The records of the Grand Historian, along with the Bamboo Annals, describe a lineage of Sha kings spanning several centuries, ending with a final ruler named Jade. a tyrant according to the texts, whose cruelty and excess triggered a rebellion led by Tang, founder of the following Shang dynasty. In this telling, the Xia didn't simply fade, it was overthrown, judged, and replaced, its fall framed as a moral lesson about the mandate of heaven and the consequences of misrule. For a long time, this was treated as legend rather than history. Unlike the Shang dynasty that followed it, no contemporary written records, no inscriptions, no documents, nothing bearing the name Xia, from the period it supposedly existed, had ever been found. The Shang, by contrast, left behind oracle bones, turtle shells and ox bones inscribed with questions posed to ancestors and spirits, unearthed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and confirmed through modern archaeology. The Xia had no equivalent. For decades, this absence led many Western historians, and even some Chinese scholars, to treat the Xia as founding myth rather than founding fact. A story China told about its own origins, rather than a chapter of verifiable history. Then came Erlitou. Excavated beginning in the late 1950s, the Erlitou site revealed something unexpected. A large, deliberately planned urban settlement, complete with a palace complex, evidence of bronze casting on a scale not previously associated with this period, and a level of social organization that implied centralized authority. The dates lined up roughly with when the Xia was said to have existed. The location matched roughly where ancient texts placed it. Many Chinese archaeologists have identified Erlitou as the material remains of the Xia dynasty, treating the correlation as strong enough to move the Xia from legend into confirmed history. But here is where the mainstream account runs into its own limits. Not a single artifact recovered from Erlitou bears the name Xia. No inscription has ever confirmed that the people living there called themselves by that name, worshipped the ancestors described in later texts, or recognized the kings later chronicled by Zhou and Han dynasty historians centuries after the fact. The connection between Erlitou and the Xia dynasty is compelling, geographically and chronologically consistent, and accepted by many scholars. But it remains, in the strictest sense, circumstantial. Some historians outside China remain more cautious, treating the identification as probable rather than proven, and noting that the absence of self-referential written evidence leaves the door open to alternative interpretations. And if Erlitou is the Xia, an equally difficult question follows. Why did it end? The traditional narrative blames the final king, Jade, and his tyranny. But tyranny, as a historical explanation, tends to arrive after the fact, offered by the victors as justification for conquest. Modern researchers have proposed other, less symbolic possibilities. Some studies point to significant climate shifts during this period, including evidence of a prolonged drought or a series of catastrophic floods along the Yellow River, environmental pressures that would have strained agriculture, weakened centralized authority, and made a population vulnerable to internal unrest or external displacement. Others have suggested more gradual explanations, a shift in trade routes, resource depletion, or a slow transfer of power to the rising Shang, in which collapse might be too dramatic a word for what may have been a more incremental decline. There is also the matter of the flood itself, the one Yu the Great is said to have tamed to found the dynasty in the first place. Some researchers have pointed to geological evidence of a massive flood event along the Yellow River, dated to roughly the right period, lending a sliver of physical plausibility to a story long treated as pure myth. Whether this represents a genuine folk memory of a real environmental catastrophe, encoded into legend over centuries of retelling, or simply a coincidence between an old story and an unrelated geological record, remains a question without a settled answer. What we're left with, ultimately, is a dynasty that exists in a strange middle space, neither fully myth nor fully confirmed history. Its capital may lie beneath the foundations already excavated at Erlitou, or it may not. Its final king may have been a tyrant whose cruelty toppled a kingdom, or a convenient villain invented generations later to legitimize the dynasty that replaced him. Its founding flood may echo a real disaster lost to deep time, or it may simply be the kind of story every early civilization tells about its own beginning. Beneath the fields of Henan, the walls and foundations of Erlitou sit largely silent on the question that matters most. They can tell us that people lived there, built there, and organized themselves with a complexity that suggests kingship. What they cannot yet tell us is what those people called themselves, or whether the name history gave them centuries later was ever the one they used at all. Not every mystery in Chinese history is about what was lost. Some are about what was decided, quickly, quietly, and by men who left almost no trace of how they made up their minds. Picture a remote garrison near the Ordos region, close to the edge of the Gobi, where the Great Wall was still being extended in the final years of the 3rd century BC. Here, far from the imperial court, a man named Fusu, eldest son of Qin Shi Huang, and by most accounts the heir presumed to inherit the empire, spent his final months overseeing construction and border defense alongside the general Mang. It was, in some ways, a strange place for a crown prince to be stationed. And that strangeness is where this mystery begins. According to the records of the grand historian, Fusu had not always been in his father's favor. Several years earlier, he had openly criticized the emperor's brutal treatment of Confucian scholars, some of whom were reportedly buried alive following the infamous burning of books that challenged Qin authority. Fusu argued for restraint, warning that harsh punishment of intellectuals so soon after unification risked destabilizing a fragile empire. Qin Shi Huang, a ruler not known for tolerating dissent, responded by sending his own son away from the capital, officially to supervise the northern frontier and General Meng Tian's campaigns against nomadic incursions, but many historians read this as something closer to exile. This detail matters, because it sets up the central question of what happened next. Was Fusu being punished, tested, or quietly protected by being kept away from a court increasingly shaped by conspiracy? The ancient sources don't fully agree, and the ambiguity has never been resolved. When Qin Shi Huang died during a tour of the eastern provinces, his death was concealed for weeks, the body hidden inside a carriage disguised by the smell of salted fish, while 2 men, the Chancellor Li Si and the eunuch Zhao, controlled access to the body, and with it, control of the empire's succession. What those 2 men did with that control is where Fusu's story turns from political sidelining into something far darker. According to Sima Qin's account, Zhao and Li Si drafted a forged edict in the dying or already dead emperor's name. The letter, addressed to Fusu and General Meng Tian at the frontier, accused both men of disloyalty and incompetence and ordered them to end their own lives. No independent copy of this letter has ever been found. Everything we know about its contents comes from later historical narrative, reconstructed after the fact by a court that had every reason to justify what followed. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't just the forgery. It's Fusu's response to it. By most accounts, General Meng Tian was immediately suspicious. He urged Fusu to question the order, to seek verification, to consider that something might be deeply wrong with a directive arriving so suddenly, so far from the capital, ordering the empire's heir to die without explanation or trial. Fusu, according to the records of the grand historian, refused to contest it. He is said to have responded that a son does not question his father's command and took his own life shortly after receiving the letter. Is this believable? Historians have debated it for centuries. Some accept the account largely as written, pointing to the deeply held Confucian principle of filial obedience that shaped Fusu's upbringing and worldview, a value system in which defying a father's explicit order, even one that demanded death, may have felt like a violation more unbearable than death itself. Under this reading, Fusu's suicide wasn't naivety. It was the tragic consequence of a moral code operating exactly as it was designed to, exploited by men who understood precisely which lever to pull. Others find the speed and totality of his compliance harder to accept. Would a man raised in a court defined by political maneuvering, surrounded by generals and advisors, truly take his own life on the strength of a single unverified letter, without attempting to confirm its authenticity or rally the loyal troops under Meng Tian's command? Some historians have suggested that the historical record itself may be incomplete or shaped by later interests, that the quiet, obedient version of Fusu's death may have been the version most convenient for Zhao Gao and Li Si, and later for Sima Qian's own narrative structure, which frequently uses stories of virtue and folly to illustrate the moral decline of the Qin dynasty. Meng Tian, notably, did not die immediately. According to the same sources, he hesitated, questioned the order, and was subsequently imprisoned before eventually being forced to take poison. If the letter's authority was strong enough to end Fusu's life within what appears to be a matter of days, why did Meng Tian's death take considerably longer to carry out? The inconsistency has led some researchers to wonder whether the surviving narrative compresses or simplifies a more complicated sequence of political maneuvering that no longer survives in any text. There's also the matter of what didn't happen. If Fusu was indeed the empire's rightful heir, commanding proximity to one of Qin's most capable generals and a significant portion of its military strength at the northern frontier, he possessed something rare among the era's political victims: the practical means to resist. He chose not to use them. Whether that choice reflects genuine devotion to a principle larger than his own survival, or reflects a manipulation so complete that resistance never felt like an available option, is a question the sources raise but never answer. What remains is a death that reshaped an empire, built almost entirely on a single letter no one alive today has ever seen. A crown prince who held the power to question a suspicious order and chose obedience instead. A general who hesitated and was killed regardless. And a succession that handed the Qin dynasty to a ruler history remembers as far weaker than the man who might have inherited it instead. Was Fusu's death an act of profound loyalty, misplaced in service of men who never deserved it? Or was it the final quiet casualty of a conspiracy so carefully constructed that even the heir to an empire never saw it coming? There is a particular kind of danger in history that rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as an army at the gates or a declaration of war. Sometimes it arrives as a single trusted advisor, standing quietly at the edge of a dying man's chamber, waiting for the right moment to speak. Picture the inner chambers of the Qin Imperial court sometime in the late summer of 210 BC, not the grand throne room seen in later depictions, but a more private guarded space, where only a handful of officials were permitted near the emperor in his final days. Among them was a man named Zhao Gao, a palace eunuch who held a position that, on paper, sounds almost administrative. He served as a tutor and legal advisor, particularly skilled in law and the technical mechanics of the Qin bureaucracy. Nothing about his official title suggests a man capable of reshaping the succession of an empire. And yet, within weeks, that is precisely what he did. To understand how, we need to understand what Zhao Gao actually controlled. As a close attendant to the emperor, he held influence over palace communications, seals, and the practical machinery through which imperial edicts were drafted and authenticated. In a court where the emperor's word was law, the ability to shape how that word was written down, sealed, and transmitted was its own form of power. Quieter than a general's, but in the right circumstances, more absolute. When Qin Shi Huang died unexpectedly during his eastern tour, Zhao Gao was one of the few people present who knew immediately. According to the records of the grand historian, he moved quickly, and with striking clarity of purpose. Rather than informing the wider court or honoring what most historians believe was the emperor's intention to pass the throne to his eldest son, Fusu, Zhao Gao approached Chancellor Li Si with a proposal that would alter the empire's future entirely. The details of that conversation, as recorded by Sima Qian, are worth sitting with. Zhao Gao is said to have reasoned that Fusu, known to favor Confucian scholars and General Meng Tian's military faction, would likely remove both men from power if he became emperor. Zhu Gao's own position, along with Li Si's, would be at risk under Fusu's rule. Their solution, according to the historical account, was to conceal the emperor's death, forge a new edict in his name, and install a different, more pliable son, Huhai, as the next emperor. Li Si's role here is one of the more uncomfortable threads in this story. As chancellor, he was arguably the most powerful civil official in the empire, a man who had helped architect the very legal and administrative systems that unified China under Qin rule. Why would someone with that much to lose agree to a conspiracy built on forgery and the death of a legitimate heir? Sima Qian's account suggests hesitation on Li Si's part, followed by Zhao Gao's warning that failure to act could cost Li Si his position, his family, and potentially his life under a ruler who didn't favor him. Whether this was genuine persuasion or something closer to a threat dressed as counsel is a distinction the ancient text doesn't fully resolve. What followed has already shaped two of the mysteries in this exploration: the forged letter that reached Fusu at the northern frontier, and the quiet, uncontested death of a crown prince who might have changed everything had he simply asked more questions. But the conspiracy didn't end with Fusu's death. It was only the beginning of what Zhao Gao would go on to do with the throne he had helped install. Huai, the new emperor, was young, inexperienced, and by most historical accounts, easily influenced. Precisely the qualities Zhao Gao appears to have selected for. Over the following months, Zhao Gao is described as steadily consolidating power around himself, eliminating rivals within the court, including, eventually, Li Si himself, who was executed after being implicated in a plot Zhao Gao may have engineered specifically to remove him. The man who had helped forge an empire's succession was, in the end, consumed by the same machinery he had used against Fusu. This is where the historical record edges toward something almost theatrical, and where mainstream history and speculation begin to blur. One of the most famous episodes attributed to Zhao Gao is the story of the deer presented as a horse, an incident in which he reportedly brought a deer before the emperor and the assembled court, calling it a horse, and watched to see which officials agreed with him and which dared to correct him. Those who called it a deer were later, according to the account, quietly removed from power, or worse. Historians disagree on how literally to take this story. Some treat it as a factual account of a calculated loyalty test, revealing just how completely Zhao Gao had come to dominate the court through fear alone. Others suggest it may be a later embellishment, a parable-like anecdote added to illustrate the absurdity and terror of Zhao Gao's grip on power, whether or not the precise event occurred exactly as described. What isn't in dispute is how the story ends. Zhao Gao's dominance over the Qin court proved to be as unstable as the throne he had manufactured. Facing rebellion spreading across the empire and a crumbling administration, Zhao Gao is said to have eventually forced Huai to take his own life as well, replacing him with yet another member of the royal family before ultimately being killed by that same successor. Within roughly 3 years of Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty that was meant to last 10,000 generations had collapsed entirely, consumed from within by the very conspiracy that was supposed to preserve it. How much of this sequence reflects a precise historical account, and how much reflects a Han Dynasty narrative constructed to explain, and perhaps morally justify, the swift collapse of the regime it replaced? Sima Qian was writing under a dynasty with every incentive to portray the Qin's final years as a cautionary tale of corruption and unchecked ambition. That doesn't mean the account is false, but it does mean the full truth of Zhao Gao's motivations, and the precise mechanics of how one palace eunuch managed to outmaneuver an empire's most powerful officials may be more complicated than a single historian, writing decades later, was able or willing to fully capture. What remains certain is this: an empire built to last 10,000 generations was undone, in large part, by decisions made in a small, guarded chamber, by men whose names most of history would rather forget. Was Zhao Gao a singular architect of catastrophe, or simply the most visible piece of a collapse that was already inevitable? And how many other conspiracies, quieter and less documented, may have shaped the empires we think we understand, without ever leaving a name behind at all? In the autumn of 201 BC, a meteor fell from the sky over the eastern reaches of the Qin Empire, or so ancient chroniclers claimed. Local officials reported that when the stone was found and examined, someone had carved words into its surface, a prophecy declaring that the first emperor would die, and his empire would be divided. Furious, Qin Shi Huang ordered the stone destroyed and everyone living nearby interrogated. No one confessed. No culprit was ever found. The emperor, by most accounts, never stopped looking over his shoulder again. This is the atmosphere in which Qin Shi Huang undertook his fifth and final tour of the empire in 210 BC. Not the confident procession of a man securing his legacy, but the anxious movement of a ruler who seemed increasingly convinced that death was hunting him personally, and that outrunning it might simply be a matter of never staying still. By this point in his reign, the emperor's pursuit of immortality had become, by the account of nearly every surviving source, a defining obsession. We've already traced one branch of that obsession in the story of Chufu, sent years earlier to search the eastern seas for mountains inhabited by immortals. But the final tour reveals a ruler pursuing salvation on multiple fronts simultaneously, sending alchemists in different directions, consulting diviners, and consuming elixirs prepared by court physicians who promised eternal life through substances that, we now understand, were quietly poisoning him. Modern analysis of historical accounts strongly suggests that Qin Shi Huang's mercury consumption, taken in the belief that the metal's permanence could be transferred to his own body, likely contributed to a slow deterioration of his health in his final years. An almost unbearable irony for a man so terrified of dying that he may have accelerated his own death in the act of trying to prevent it. Ancient texts add another strange episode to this final journey. According to some accounts, an emissary encountered a mysterious figure who returned a jade disc, once given by the emperor as an offering to a river god, along with a cryptic warning that, this year, the ancestor dragon will die. The emperor is said to have consulted diviners about the meaning of the phrase, and was reportedly told the omen referred to spirits rather than to himself directly, an interpretation that let him continue his journey, though whether he was fully convinced remains, like much of this story, unrecorded. The tour proceeded east and south, passing through regions the emperor had visited before, stopping at sacred sites, making offerings, and continuing to search for signs of the immortality he had spent decades pursuing. It was during this journey in the summer heat of 210 BC, somewhere near the town of Shakyu, that Qin Shi Huang died. The exact cause remains undetermined in the historical record. Whether illness, the cumulative effects of mercury poisoning, or something else entirely, is never specified by Sima Qian, whose account focuses instead on what happened immediately afterward, which is, in its own way, the more revealing mystery. We've already examined how Zhao Gao and Li Si chose not to announce the death, how the body was concealed inside the Imperial carriage, how salted fish were reportedly transported alongside it to mask the smell of decay in the summer heat, and how this concealment bought the time needed to forge a will, redirect the succession, and eliminate Fusu before he could challenge it. What's worth returning to here, at the level of the death itself, is just how exposed and fragile this deception really was. Consider the scale of what had to be maintained. An imperial procession of this size would have included dozens, if not hundreds, of officials, guards, and attendants. Meals were still delivered to the emperor's carriage as though he remained alive. Reports were still submitted for his review, and responses, presumably drafted by Zhao Gao or others within the inner circle, were still issued in his name. For this deception to hold for as long as it reportedly did, an unknown number of people would have needed to either believe the fiction or already be complicit in maintaining it. How many officials in that procession understood or suspected the truth before the empire itself did? The historical record offers no names beyond the two principal conspirators, which raises a quieter question beneath the more dramatic one. Was this truly the work of just two men, or the work of many, whose silence was never recorded because silence, by definition, leaves no trace? There is also the matter of what wasn't done. If Qin Shi Huang had genuinely intended to pass the throne to Fusu, as most historians believe based on the letter Zhao Gao and Li Si are said to have intercepted and rewritten, why had no clearer, more secure mechanism for succession already been established during the emperor's lifetime? For a ruler so consumed by the fear of death that he sent expeditions across oceans and consumed poison in the hope of avoiding it entirely, Qin Shi Huang appears to have given remarkably little formal protected structure to what would happen when death arrived anyway. Some historians read this as a symptom of his obsession itself. A man so committed to the idea that he might never die that he neglected to seriously prepare for the possibility that he would. Others suggest that succession plans may have existed and were simply erased or overwritten in the chaos and conspiracy that followed, lost along with so much else from those final, carefully hidden weeks. What we're left with is a death surrounded by omens that may have been warnings, coincidences, or later additions designed to make an ending feel like it had been foretold all along. A ruler who spent enormous resources searching for eternal life while inadvertently poisoning himself in the process. And a conspiracy so consequential to Chinese history that it reshaped an entire dynasty's succession, built on a concealment so precarious that its success still seems, in hindsight, almost improbable. Did Qin Shi Huang die believing, even briefly, that he had found some version of the immortality he sought, only for his body to be hidden away by men more interested in the empire he left behind than the man himself? Or did he understand, in his final days, exactly what kind of men surrounded him, and simply run out of time to do anything about it? A single object, small enough to hold in two hands, is said to have decided the fate of Chinese dynasties for over 1,000 years. Not a weapon, not an army. A carved piece of jade, roughly the size of a fist, said to have been passed from ruler to ruler as proof, the only proof that mattered, of who was truly permitted to sit on the throne of China. This was the heirloom seal of the realm, and according to tradition, its story begins not with Qin Shi Huang, but slightly before him, with a piece of jade known as the He Shi. Legend describes a man named Bian He, who discovered a remarkable stone in the state of Chu sometime in the 8th century BC, and attempted to present it to two successive kings, both of whom, believing the uncut stone worthless, ordered his foot amputated as punishment for the perceived deception. Only under a third king was the stone finally cut open, revealing flawless jade inside. A story that, whether historical or symbolic, established the object's reputation as something whose true value could only be recognized by those wise enough to look beneath the surface. Centuries later, that same jade, according to historical tradition, came into the possession of Qin Shi Huang after his unification of China. He is said to have ordered it carved into an imperial seal, inscribed with 8 characters proclaiming that having received the mandate of heaven, the emperor's life and long reign would flourish. From this point forward, the seal was treated not merely as a tool of state, used to authenticate imperial decrees, but as a physical embodiment of legitimate rule itself, not unlike the 9 tripod cauldrons before it. To possess the seal was to possess heaven's endorsement. To rule without it was to rule under a shadow of doubt. What follows is a trail that winds through nearly every major dynasty in Chinese history and grows less certain with each retelling. According to tradition, the seal passed from the Qin to the Han dynasty, reportedly surrendered by the last Qin ruler as an acknowledgement of defeat. From there, historical accounts describe it moving through the hands of subsequent dynasties, Wei, Jin, and beyond, sometimes captured in war, sometimes inherited peacefully, occasionally vanishing for years at a time before resurfacing in the possession of a new claimant to the throne. Some records describe the seal being physically damaged during these transitions, a corner chipped or broken during a violent seizure of power, later repaired with gold, a flaw that, rather than diminishing its authority, seems to have only added to its legend. By the time we reach the later centuries of the first millennium AD, the historical trail becomes noticeably harder to follow with confidence. Multiple dynasties and warlords throughout Chinese history claimed to possess the authentic seal, and multiple objects were presented as such, which immediately raises an uncomfortable possibility. If the seal could be so easily claimed by rival courts during periods of fragmentation, how many of these claims were ever genuine, and how many were political theater, using an object whose true authenticity had already become impossible to verify? The most commonly cited disappearance dates to the early 10th century, during the collapse of the Tang dynasty and the chaotic period that followed, sometimes called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. According to several historical accounts, the reigning emperor at the time, facing military defeat and the collapse of his court, either destroyed the seal himself or lost it during the chaos of his final days. And after this point, no source describes the object being seen again with any credible verification. That hasn't stopped rulers from claiming otherwise. In the centuries that followed, several dynasties, including the Song and later the Yuan, recorded discoveries of objects presented as the original heirloom seal, often conveniently timed to reinforce a new ruler's claim to legitimacy. Scholars at the time were frequently skeptical, and these later rediscoveries are treated by most modern historians as almost certainly fabrications, forged to serve immediate political needs rather than genuine recoveries of a lost artifact. The pattern itself is telling. Across centuries, whenever a ruler needed to bolster a fragile claim to power, a jade seal, conveniently matching ancient descriptions, seemed to reappear. This raises a deeper question that runs beneath the entire mystery. Was the original seal truly lost during the Five Dynasties period, destroyed in some act of desperation by a defeated emperor unwilling to let it fall into enemy hands? Or had it already vanished quietly, sometime earlier, replaced for generations by increasingly distant reproductions, with even the rulers who possessed it uncertain whether what they held was the genuine object passed down from Huang, or merely the story of that object, recreated in jade to preserve a legitimacy no one dared question too closely. No object definitively confirmed as the original seal survives today. No modern archaeological discovery has produced anything scholars broadly accept as the authentic artifact described in these ancient accounts. What survives instead is the idea of the seal, its described appearance, its inscribed characters, its journey through more than a millennium of Chinese political history, carried forward entirely through written record, without the physical object itself ever available to confirm or contradict what those records claim. There's something worth sitting with in that. For over 1,000 years, the legitimacy of emperors, the outcome of wars, and the perceived favor of heaven itself were tied to a single piece of carved jade, an object whose authenticity, even at the height of its influence, may have already been more a matter of belief than a verifiable fact. If dynasties could rise and fall on the strength of possessing a seal whose true origins even contemporary scholars struggled to confirm, what does that suggest about the nature of legitimacy itself in early Chinese political history, and how much of what we call ancient historical fact was, even then, resting on foundations no more solid than a story everyone had agreed to believe? Somewhere, perhaps, a small carved stone still exists, buried in a tomb, sunk at the bottom of a lake, or simply lost among the countless unremarkable jade fragments unearthed and discarded over centuries of Chinese archaeology, its significance no longer recognizable to anyone who might find it. Or perhaps it was destroyed exactly as the old accounts claim, and the seal that once decided the fate of an empire has been gone for over 1,000 years, leaving only its legend behind to do the deciding instead. Every civilization eventually reaches backward far enough that history stops looking like history and starts looking like something else entirely. Not quite myth, not quite memory, but a strange third category that scholars have never fully agreed how to name. Picture a temple complex in Shanxi province, near the Chao Mountain, where for over 2,000 years, emperors, warlords, and modern heads of state alike have traveled to perform a single, remarkably consistent ritual, paying respects at what is described as the tomb of Huang, the Yellow Emperor. Incense still burns there. Ceremonies still take place, sometimes broadcast, sometimes attended by tens of thousands of people. And yet the man honored at that site, considered by tradition to be the common ancestor of the Chinese people, the founder of Chinese civilization itself, may never have existed as a single physical human being at all. According to the earliest surviving accounts compiled centuries after he supposedly lived, Huang ruled sometime around the 27th century BC, a period so early that it predates not only the Xia dynasty we explored earlier, but any archaeological site that scholars have confidently linked to centralized rule in China. He is credited across various texts with an almost impossible range of achievements. Defeating rival tribal leaders to unify the early Chinese peoples, inventing or overseeing the invention of the wheel, the compass, silk cultivation, written language, and the foundations of Chinese medicine still referenced today through texts like the Huang or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. No single ruler in any civilization typically receives credit for this many foundational inventions. And that, historians argue, is precisely the point worth examining. The mainstream scholarly position is that Huangdi likely represents not one person, but a composite, a symbolic figure onto whom successive generations projected the origins of nearly everything they considered essential to Chinese identity. Under this reading, the Yellow Emperor functions less as a historical king and more as a kind of narrative anchor, a single name capable of unifying centuries of scattered technological, cultural, and political developments into one coherent origin story. Civilizations elsewhere have done something similar. What makes the Chinese case unusual is the degree to which Huangdi's legend became inseparable from actual political legitimacy for thousands of years afterward, with emperors across multiple dynasties tracing, or claiming to trace, their lineage directly back to him. This is where the mystery becomes less about whether Huangdi existed and more about why the claim of descent from him mattered so intensely for so long. Ancient texts describe Huangdi's reign in ways that blend plausible political history with elements far harder to categorize. He is said to have fought a legendary battle against a rival leader named Qiu at a place called Zhou, a conflict described in some accounts with details that edge toward the supernatural. Fog summoned to disorient enemy forces, a compass-like device built specifically to navigate through it, and allies described as spirits or unusual beings assisting in the fighting. Some historians read this battle as a heavily mythologized memory of a genuine early conflict between rival Neolithic groups in northern China, the supernatural elements added over centuries of oral retelling. Others caution against assuming any specific historical event lies beneath the story at all, noting that societies frequently invent founding battles retroactively to explain how a particular cultural or political order came to dominate a region. Archaeology complicates the picture further, rather than resolving it. No site has ever been identified that matches the scale, sophistication, or time frame described for Huangdi's supposed capital or kingdom. The Neolithic cultures that did exist in northern China during the relevant period, including sites associated with the Yangshao and Longshan cultures, show genuine evidence of increasing social complexity, early metallurgy, and organized settlements, but nothing that definitively points to a single unifying ruler matching the scope of achievement attributed to Huangdi in later texts. This absence doesn't disprove the possibility that a real, influential leader existed somewhere within this broader cultural landscape. It simply means that if he did, the archaeological record has not yet, and may never, isolate him from the collective achievements of the culture he's said to represent. There's also a stranger thread running through some, later, more esoteric texts. Descriptions of Huangdi as something more than mortal, capable of communicating with spirits, achieving immortality himself, or ascending to the heavens on the back of a dragon at the end of his earthly reign, rather than dying in any conventional sense. These accounts are generally treated by mainstream historians as later Taoist elaborations, added centuries after the earliest historical references, reflecting religious and philosophical movements that had their own reasons for reshaping Huangdi into a figure closer to a deity than a king. But their persistence, across such a long span of Chinese religious and cultural history, suggests that Huangdi's identity was never fully settled, even among the people who revered him most. He seems to have been continuously reinterpreted by every era that needed him into whatever kind of ancestor that era required. Which leaves us with an unusual kind of historical figure. Not proven, not disproven, but functionally real in the sense that matters most to the civilization that has carried his name for over 4,000 years. Emperors invoked him to legitimize their rule. Physicians attributed medical knowledge to him to lend it authority. Modern ceremonies still gather crowds at his reputed tomb, treating the site with a reverence that doesn't appear to depend on resolving the underlying historical question at all. Perhaps that's the detail worth sitting with longest. Whether or not a single man named Huang ever walked the plains of northern China 5,000 years ago, something at the root of Chinese civilization needed him to have existed. Needed a name, a face, a single point of origin around which an entire cultural identity could be built. Is the Yellow Emperor a genuine memory of a real founding figure, worn smooth and reshaped by 5,000 years of retelling? Or is he something rarer and more revealing still? A civilization's chosen reflection of itself, projected backward into the deepest past it could reach, until the reflection became indistinguishable from the history it was meant to explain. Some rulers are remembered as tyrants, others as visionaries. Wang Mang remains one of the rare figures in Chinese history who is still argued over as both, a man modern scholars have variously called a scheming usurper, and a socialist a full 2,000 years ahead of his time, and no consensus has ever fully settled the matter. Picture the ruins of Weiyang Palace in Chang'an, once the beating administrative heart of the Han Dynasty, later the seat of a new, short-lived dynasty that Wang Mang declared into existence in AD 9. Today, only foundation platforms and rammed earth terraces remain, excavated and studied by archaeologists piecing together the layout of a court that, for 15 turbulent years, attempted something almost unheard of in Chinese imperial history. Not merely a change of ruler, but a wholesale reinvention of the dynasty itself, under a name that had never existed before and would never exist again. Wang Mang did not seize power through conquest. He rose through the Han bureaucracy as a relative of the imperial consort clan, building a reputation for scholarly discipline, personal frugality, and Confucian moral rigor that stood in sharp contrast to what many at court saw as a decadent and increasingly unstable imperial family. Over roughly 2 decades, he accumulated influence as regent, positioning himself as the indispensable steward of a weakening dynasty, until, in AD 9, he formally deposed the child emperor he had been serving and declared the founding of the Shun dynasty, meaning, fittingly, new. What makes Wang Mang genuinely strange as a historical figure isn't the manner of his rise, which follows a pattern familiar to students of court politics in nearly every dynasty. It's what he did once he held the throne. Wang Mang initiated a series of sweeping reforms that read, even by modern standards, as remarkably radical. He attempted to abolish private ownership of land, redistributing it based on Confucian ideals of equity drawn from ancient, possibly idealized descriptions of earlier well-field systems. He outlawed the private buying and selling of slaves. He nationalized key industries, including salt, iron, and currency production, and introduced new coinage systems intended to stabilize an economy he believed had been destabilized by wealthy elites. Some modern historians, looking back at these policies, have drawn comparisons to socialist economic planning, a description that feels almost anachronistic applied to a ruler operating 2,000 years before the term existed, and yet the comparison keeps resurfacing because the parallels are difficult to dismiss entirely. Why would a Confucian traditionalist, a man who built his early reputation on ancient moral philosophy rather than innovation, pursue reforms this aggressive? The most widely accepted explanation is that Wang Mang genuinely believed he was restoring an idealized ancient order, not inventing a new one. That his land redistribution and economic controls were, in his own mind, a return to virtuous systems described in classical texts, corrupted over centuries by greed and mismanagement. Under this reading, Wang Mang wasn't a revolutionary in the modern sense. He was a restorationist whose vision of the past simply happened to look, in practice, startlingly progressive. But this explanation doesn't fully account for the speed and severity of what followed. Almost immediately, Wang Mang's reforms triggered chaos. Landowners resisted redistribution fiercely, often violently. The new currency systems, introduced and revised multiple times in rapid succession, caused significant economic disruption and confusion. Confucian officials themselves, ironically, became some of his fiercest critics, arguing that his policies, however philosophically justified, were being implemented with a rigidity that ignored practical reality on the ground. Meanwhile, natural disasters compounded the unrest. Historical records describe a catastrophic shift in the course of the Yellow River during this period, one of several major changes the river has undergone throughout Chinese history, displacing enormous populations and triggering widespread famine at precisely the moment the empire could least afford instability. Rebellion followed, and it came from an unexpected direction. A movement known as the Red Eyebrows, so named for the red pigment rebels reportedly painted on their faces to distinguish themselves in battle, rose largely from among displaced peasants suffering under famine and economic collapse. Arguably the very population Wang Meng's reforms had been designed to help. There is a particular, almost tragic irony embedded in this detail, one historians have returned to repeatedly. Was Wang Mang undone by the wealthy elites his policies threatened, or by the very peasantry his reforms were ostensibly meant to protect, driven to rebellion not by his ideals, but by the chaotic, mismanaged reality of their execution? Wang Mang's end came in AD 23, when rebel forces breached Chang'an and stormed the palace. According to the Book of Han, compiled under the restored Han dynasty that followed him, Wang Mang retreated to a tower within the palace complex, surrounded by a small number of loyal officials, and was ultimately killed there, his body reportedly torn apart by the invading soldiers, his head displayed publicly as confirmation that the Qin dynasty's brief, strange experiment had ended. Because the primary historical account of Wang Mang's reign was compiled by the Han dynasty that replaced him, and that he had, in turn, replaced, the same question arises here that has surfaced throughout much of this exploration. How much of Wang Mang's portrayal as an overreaching usurper reflects an accurate historical record, and how much reflects the political necessity of a restored Han court needing to justify its own legitimacy by discrediting the 15 years that came before it? Some modern historians have begun re-examining Wang Mang's reforms with more sympathy, suggesting that a ruler dismissed for centuries as a failed usurper may have simply been implementing reasonable, even prescient ideas at a moment of environmental and economic crisis that would have destabilized almost any government, regardless of its policies. What remains genuinely unresolved is the character of the man at the center of it. Was Wang Mang a sincere idealist, undone by forces and natural disasters entirely beyond his control? A calculating opportunist who used moral philosophy as a convenient vehicle for personal ambition? Or something harder to categorize still, a ruler whose vision, however genuinely held, was simply incompatible with the realities of the empire he inherited, regardless of how carefully that vision had been reasoned out. 2,000 years later, the foundations of Weiyang Palace remain partially excavated, offering fragments of a court that briefly attempted to remake an empire from the ground up. What they cannot offer is certainty about the man who ordered it built in his own dynasty's image. Whether history remembers him accurately, or whether, like so much else in this story, the truth was buried the moment the palace fell. History has a particular fondness for men who become too useful to their rulers, and then, almost without exception, too dangerous to let live. Few stories illustrate that pattern more precisely, or more chillingly, than what happened inside a bell chamber in Chang'an, sometime in early 196 BC. Picture the room itself, as later accounts describe it. A private chamber within the palace of Empress Lu, wife of Emperor Gaozu, founder of the Han dynasty. The walls are said to have been draped with heavy silk. At the center stood a large bronze bell, an instrument, or so the story goes, that would soon become something far darker than a musical object. Into this room, according to the records of the Grand Historian, one of the most brilliant military strategists China had ever produced was lured under false pretenses and never walked out alive. His name was Han Xin, and to understand why his death remains debated over 2,000 years later, we first have to understand how extraordinary his rise had been. Han Xin began his life in poverty, a detail ancient sources return to repeatedly, as if setting up a deliberate contrast with what followed. Stories describe him enduring public humiliation as a young man, including a famous incident in which he is said to have crawled between the legs of a local bully rather than fight and risk arrest, a choice later reframed by historians as evidence of extraordinary self-control rather than cowardice. Whatever the truth of these early anecdotes, what's better documented is what came next. Han Xin joined the forces of Liu Bang, the man who would become Emperor Gaozu, during the chaotic power struggle that followed the collapse of the Qin dynasty we've already traced through Zhao Gao's conspiracy and Fusu's death. Within that struggle, Han Xin proved to be something close to a military prodigy. He is credited with a series of campaigns and tactical innovations that repeatedly turned seemingly hopeless situations in Liu Bang's favor, including maneuvers still studied and referenced in Chinese military thought today. Deliberately positioning troops with their backs to a river, removing any possibility of retreat to force his own soldiers into fighting with total commitment against a numerically superior enemy. His contributions were not incidental. Most historians agree that without Han Xin's generalship, Liu Bang's victory over his rivals, and the founding of the Han dynasty itself would have been far less certain, and possibly impossible. And this is precisely where the danger began. A ruler who owes his throne to a general of Han Xin's caliber faces an uncomfortable arithmetic. The same skill that wins an empire can, in theory, unwind it just as easily in the hands of a man with sufficient ambition, or even without any ambition at all, simply by existing as living proof that the empire could have gone a different way. Liu Bang, once he secured the throne, began a gradual, calculated process of reducing Han Xin's power. He was stripped of his most significant military command and eventually demoted from King of Chu, a substantial territory granted for his wartime service, down to a lesser noble title, kept close to the capital where his movements could be more easily observed. Han Xin, by most accounts, understood exactly what was happening to him, and the historical record suggests a man caught in an increasingly narrow set of choices. Some later chronicles claim that he was approached, or considered approaching others, about the possibility of rebellion, frustrated by his diminished status despite his service. Whether these claims reflect genuine plotting on Han Xin's part, or accusations manufactured by rivals eager to eliminate a man whose talents made him permanently suspect regardless of his actual intentions, is a question the ancient sources never fully resolve. What is recorded with more confidence is how his life ended. In 196 BC, while Emperor Gaozu was away suppressing an unrelated rebellion, Empress Liu, acting with the Chancellor Xiaohe, the very official who had originally recommended Han Xin to Liu Bang decades earlier, moved against him. Xiaohe is said to have lured Han Xin to the palace under the pretense of a celebration marking the suppression of the rebellion elsewhere, assuring him it was safe to attend despite his understandable wariness of the court. Once inside, according to the records of the Grand Historian, Han Xin was seized. Here, the story acquires one of its strangest and most specific details, the kind that tends to lodge itself permanently in historical memory precisely because it's so oddly precise. Emperor Gaozu had reportedly once promised Han Xin that he would never be executed by blade, by rope, or beneath open sky. A guarantee, whether sincere or merely symbolic, that seemed to protect him from conventional forms of execution. Empress Liu's solution, according to tradition, was to have him killed inside that draped chamber, struck down by palace women wielding sharpened bamboo staves rather than metal blades, beneath a canopy rather than open sky, technically honoring the letter of a promise while obliterating its spirit entirely. Is this account historically precise, or has it been shaped, like so much of Han Xin's story, into something closer to parable? A vivid illustration of how easily a ruler's word can be honored technically while being betrayed completely? Historians remain divided. The specificity of the detail, the bamboo staves, the draped canopy, the deliberate avoidance of blade and open sky, feels almost too neatly constructed, the kind of narrative flourish later chroniclers sometimes added to underscore a moral point. And yet the broader outcome, Han Xin's death at Empress Lu's order while Gao Zhu was absent from the capital is treated by most historians as substantially accurate, even if some of the surrounding theatrical detail may have been embellished in the retelling. What remains genuinely uncertain is Gao Zhu's own role in all of this. Did the emperor return to Chang'an and learn of Han Xin's death as a surprised bystander, relieved that a dangerous rival had been eliminated without his direct order, or complicit from a distance, having quietly signaled that such an outcome would not be unwelcome? The records of the Grand Historian describes his reaction with notable ambiguity, suggesting both grief and satisfaction, a combination that has left historians questioning ever since whether Gao Zhu's sorrow was genuine, performative, or some uneasy mixture of both. There's also a broader pattern worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond Han Xin alone. Several other prominent generals and officials who helped found the Han Dynasty met similarly abrupt ends in the years following Gao Zhu's consolidation of power, a pattern historians have long recognized as characteristic of dynastic founders who, having achieved victory, moved quickly to eliminate anyone capable of threatening the stability of what they had built. Han Xin's death fits neatly into this larger, almost predictable rhythm of imperial history. And yet the specific manner of his death, staged so precisely around a broken promises technical loophole, continues to stand apart. Too particular, too pointed, to feel entirely like coincidence. Was Han Xin a genuine threat to the throne he had helped secure? A brilliant strategist whose ambitions eventually outgrew his usefulness? Or was he simply the most talented man in a court that had already decided, the moment the fighting stopped, that talent like his could never again be permitted to remain unsupervised? Somewhere inside a chamber that no longer exists, beneath a canopy meant to satisfy the letter of a promise while erasing everything the promise was meant to protect, one of history's greatest generals died in a manner precise enough to still raise questions 2,000 years later about exactly whose hands were truly responsible. A cup of spiced wine, offered as a New Year's gift from a trusted father-in-law to a 14-year-old emperor, sits at the center of one of the Han Dynasty's quietest and most consequential unsolved deaths. Picture the imperial court of Chang'an in the winter of AD 6, a palace still operating under the outward rituals of Han authority, even as the real machinery of power had shifted almost entirely into the hands of a single, ambitious regent. The emperor himself, a boy named Liu Kan, posthumously known as Emperor Ping, had been placed on the throne at only 9 years old, following the death of his predecessor. He was, by design, never meant to rule in any meaningful sense. He was meant to occupy a seat that someone else was steadily emptying of all real authority. That someone was Wang Mang. We've already traced Wang Mang's later transformation into the founder of the short-lived Qin dynasty, his sweeping reforms, and his eventual violent downfall at the hands of the Red Eyebrow rebels. But years before any of that, Wang Mang built the foundation for his rise through a slower, more patient method, positioning himself as regent to a series of young, pliable emperors, consolidating influence gradually enough that by the time anyone recognized the scale of what was happening, resistance had become almost impossible. Emperor Ping was the second child ruler Wang Mang oversaw in this capacity, and by most historical accounts, the relationship between regent and emperor followed a familiar, uneasy pattern. Public deference from Wang Mang, layered over near-total practical control. To secure his position further, Wang Mang arranged for his own daughter to marry the young emperor, making himself not only regent, but father-in-law to the throne he effectively controlled. On the surface, this looked like the natural consolidation of a powerful family's influence, a common enough strategy throughout Chinese imperial history. Beneath the surface, according to the Book of Han, tension was building that would not stay contained for long. As Emperor Ping grew older, moving through adolescence toward the age at which a Han emperor might reasonably be expected to assume genuine authority, sources describe a young ruler growing increasingly resentful of his regent's continued dominance. Some accounts suggest Ping had begun expressing frustration, even open hostility, toward Wang Mang's control, and toward the fact that his own mother's family, the Wei clan, had been deliberately kept away from the capital and denied any meaningful influence at court. a calculated move by Mang to prevent a rival power base from forming around the emperor's maternal relatives. This is the tension present in the winter of AD 6, when, according to the Book of Han, Mang presented the young emperor with a cup of spiced wine as a New Year's offering. Shortly afterward, Emperor Ping fell seriously ill. His condition worsened rapidly, and within a short period, he was dead at only 14 years old. The historical record does not shy away from naming the suspicion directly. Bangu, the Han Dynasty historian who compiled the Book of Han, records the belief held by at least some at the time that Wang Mang had poisoned the emperor himself, eliminating a ruler who was growing old enough and resentful enough to threaten the regent's continued grip on power. This is a notable departure from some of the more ambiguous deaths we've examined throughout this exploration. Here, a specific historical text names a specific suspect tied to a specific object, a cup of wine, and a specific motive: self-preservation against a maturing emperor who had every reason to resent him. And yet, even with this unusual directness, the case remains genuinely unresolved, for reasons that deserve careful attention rather than easy acceptance. Bangu was writing during the restored Han Dynasty, generations after Wang Mang's death, working within a historical and political tradition that had every incentive to portray the founder of the short-lived Qin dynasty as an irredeemable villain. We've already seen in Wang Mang's own chapter how thoroughly his later reputation was shaped by historians writing under the dynasty he had briefly displaced. A poisoning accusation, appearing in this context, carries the same problem we've encountered elsewhere in this series. How much of it reflects a documented historical fact, witnessed and recorded contemporaneously, and how much reflects a convenient narrative detail, added or emphasized later to reinforce Wang Mang's image as a scheming usurper whose ambitions stretched back even to the murder of a child he had personally arranged to marry into his own family. Complicating the picture further, some historical accounts describe an entirely different version of events surrounding Wang Mang's reaction to Ping's death, one that sits uneasily alongside a straightforward poisoning narrative. Sources describe Wang Mang engaging in elaborate, seemingly sincere rituals of grief and prayer, reportedly even offering himself to heaven as a substitute for the dying emperor's life, composing a formal prayer that was later sealed away, according to some accounts, in a box within the Imperial archives, not to be opened publicly. If Wang Mang had indeed orchestrated the emperor's death, this level of documented ritualized grief reads as either extraordinarily calculated performance or as evidence that the poisoning accusation may not tell the complete story of what those closest to the situation actually believed at the time. There is also a simpler, less dramatic possibility that modern historians have not entirely dismissed. Adolescent mortality in ancient China, even within the relative comfort of the imperial court, remained significantly higher than modern standards. And illness, unrelated to any deliberate act, could plausibly explain a young emperor's sudden decline and death without requiring a conspiracy at all. Under this reading, the poisoning accusation may represent a case of suspicious timing, a resentful young emperor's convenient death interpreted through the lens of a regent who had every reason to want him gone, transforming what may have been a natural tragedy into a politically useful murder narrative, whether or not an actual poisoning ever took place. What we're left with ultimately is a death positioned at an uncomfortable intersection of documented historical accusation and irreducible uncertainty. A named suspect, a named motive, a specific object, a cup of wine, offered on a specific occasion, and yet no method by which any of it can be conclusively verified, separated from the political interests of the historians who recorded it generations later. Did Wang Mang eliminate a maturing emperor who had grown too resentful and too old to remain safely under his control, choosing poison as a method quiet enough to leave no obvious trace beyond suspicion itself? Or did a 14-year-old boy simply succumb to illness at an unfortunate moment, his death reshaped after the fact into a murder that better suited the narrative of the man who inherited his throne? Somewhere between a sealed prayer box in the Imperial archives and a suspicious cup of New Year's wine, the truth of Emperor Ping's final days remains exactly where so much of ancient Chinese history seems to rest. Just beyond the reach of certainty, close enough to see, too far to confirm. Uncertainty, we've seen again and again in this exploration, tends to surround the deaths of individual men. But sometimes what vanishes into uncertainty isn't a person at all. Sometimes it's the record itself. The very material future historians would need to know what happened, deliberately reduced to ash by the same empire that had spent decades compiling it. Picture the Imperial archives at Xinyang, the Qin capital, sometime around 213 BC. Shelves, or more accurately racks and cases, held not paper as we'd recognize it today, but bundles of bamboo strips and rolls of silk, painstakingly inscribed by hand, representing centuries of accumulated philosophy, history, poetry, and regional chronicles from the many kingdoms Qin Shi Huang had spent his reign conquering and absorbing. These archives represented something valuable beyond their content alone. They represented memory itself, the accumulated intellectual inheritance of a civilization that, until recently, had never been unified under a single ruler. According to the records of the Grand Historian, the order to destroy much of this material came directly from Qin Shi Huang, acting on the advice of his chancellor, Li Si, the same official we've already encountered at the center of the succession conspiracy following the emperor's death. The circumstances leading to the order are described with unusual specificity for an event this old. A court debate, reportedly held during a banquet, had turned toward the question of whether the newly unified empire should be governed according to ancient precedent, with power distributed among regional nobles as it had been under earlier dynasties, or according to the centralized legalist principles Qin had used to conquer its rivals in the first place. Confucian scholars at court argued for the former, invoking historical example after historical example to make their case. Li Si, according to the surviving account, saw something dangerous in this pattern. If scholars could continually appeal to the past to critique the present, using historical precedent as a permanent tool for undermining Qin's new centralized order, the empire's stability would remain perpetually vulnerable to intellectual dissent rooted in nostalgia for what had come before. His proposed solution, and the one Qin Shi Huang ultimately approved, was severe. The mass destruction of historical records and philosophical texts from outside the state of Qin, with limited exceptions carved out for practical works on medicine, agriculture, and divination, subjects considered useful rather than ideologically threatening. What followed, according to tradition, was a purge unlike anything in Chinese history to that point. Regional chronicles documenting the histories of the very kingdoms Qin had recently conquered were reportedly targeted with particular severity, and detail that historians have long found significant. This wasn't simply an attack on philosophy in the abstract. It was, many argue, a calculated effort to sever conquered populations from their own distinct historical identities, leaving Qin's version of unified history as the only version anyone could still consult. Private possession of banned texts was made a punishable offense, and scholars caught concealing forbidden works faced severe consequences. This event has traditionally been paired with an even darker episode the following year, in 212 BC, the reported execution of several hundred scholars, allegedly buried alive on Qin Shi Huang's orders after they were accused of spreading criticism of his rule and pursuing what the emperor considered fraudulent or seditious teachings. Some of it tied to the same failed quest for immortality that had earlier sent Shu Fu across the Eastern Sea. Together, the burning of the books and the burial of the scholars have been remembered for over 2,000 years as twin symbols of intellectual suppression, frequently cited as the moment Qin Shi Huang's legacy shifted decisively from ambitious unifier to tyrant. But how much of this account reflects precisely what happened, and how much reflects the interpretive lens of the historians who recorded it generations later? This is a question worth taking seriously, because the primary source for both events, once again, is Sima Qian, writing during the Han Dynasty, decades after Qin's collapse, within a historical tradition that had strong incentive to portray the previous dynasty in the darkest possible terms to justify its own legitimacy. Some modern historians have raised pointed questions about the scale traditionally attributed to these events. Was the burning truly as comprehensive and empire-wide as later accounts suggest? Or was it a more targeted, Though still genuinely severe, suppression focused primarily on the archives at the capital and among scholars directly connected to the court. Did the buried scholars number in the hundreds as traditionally described? Or has the figure been amplified over centuries of retelling, transforming a serious but smaller act of political violence into the maximally damning symbol later dynasties needed it to be? Archaeological discoveries in more recent decades have added genuine complexity to this picture, rather than resolving it cleanly in either direction. Bamboo and silk texts predating or contemporary with the Qin period have occasionally surfaced in tombs sealed before or shortly after the alleged burning. Texts covering philosophy, administration, and history that, according to the traditional account, should have been entirely destroyed. Their survival doesn't necessarily disprove that a significant purge occurred. It may simply indicate that the destruction, however severe, was never as absolute as later accounts implied, with private copies surviving in regional collections, buried with their owners, or hidden successfully enough to escape Qin officials entirely. What it does suggest is that the traditional narrative of total, empire-wide annihilation of pre-Qin knowledge may be, at minimum, an exaggeration of a genuinely destructive, but ultimately incomplete, campaign. There's a deeper irony worth sitting with here as well. Qin Shi Huang's reported goal, according to the traditional account, was to prevent history from being used as a weapon against his new order, to sever the empire from competing historical narratives that might destabilize centralized rule. And yet the event itself became one of history's most enduring weapons against his own reputation, cited for over 2,000 years by nearly every subsequent dynasty as definitive proof of Qin tyranny, used repeatedly to justify why the mandate of heaven had rightfully passed to whoever came next. If the purge was intended to control the historical narrative, it accomplished something closer to the opposite. It became the narrative, permanently attached to Qin Shi Huang's legacy in a way no surviving text from his own reign was ever able to counterbalance or contextualize. What remains, finally, is an absence shaped almost entirely by the accounts of those who came after. We know an order was given. We know with reasonable confidence that some genuine, significant destruction of texts occurred, and that scholars were killed in some capacity connected to Qin Shi Huang's later, increasingly paranoid years. What we cannot know with certainty is the true scale, the precise reasoning beyond what later historians chose to preserve, or how much genuine knowledge, how many regional histories, how many alternate accounts of the very events we've spent this exploration examining, were lost in the fire, never to be weighed against the version of history that did survive to reach us. Was Qin Shi Huang's purge the calculated act of totalizing control later dynasties described, or a smaller, still severe episode magnified by 2,000 years of retelling into something even the fire itself may never have fully achieved? Somewhere in that gap between record and reality, an unknown portion of ancient Chinese history simply stopped existing, and no one left to ask can say for certain what it once contained. Long before he became the man whose death would be disguised by carts of salted fish, whose tomb would be guarded by an army of clay soldiers, whose name would eventually be erased from and restored to Chinese history in equal measure, King Zheng of Qin came within the length of an outstretched sleeve of never becoming Qin Shi Huang at all. Picture the throne room of the Qin Palace in 227 BC, 13 years before unification, 6 years before the future emperor would even claim the title history remembers him by. A map lies unrolled across a low table, its silk surface catching the light, representing territory that an envoy from the neighboring state of Yan has come to formally cede to Qin. Advisors and officials line the hall in careful formation. King Zheng, already the most powerful ruler among China's warring states, watches as the envoy approaches to present the map, the final ceremonial step before the audience concludes. What no one in that room fully anticipates is that the map itself is a weapon, and the man unrolling it has come to kill the king. The envoy's name was Jing Ke, and the plot that brought him into that throne room remains one of the most thoroughly documented and most persistently debated assassination attempts in early Chinese history. The historical context matters here as much as the event itself. By 227 BC, Qin's military campaigns had already devastated much of northern China, and the state of Yan, weaker and increasingly desperate, faced near certain conquest. According to the records of the Grand Historian, Crown Prince Dan of Yan, who had once been held as a hostage in Qin and reportedly nursed a deep personal grievance against King Zheng from that experience, concluded that conventional warfare offered no realistic hope of saving his state. His alternative plan was audacious even by the standards of an era defined by court intrigue. Eliminate the Qin king directly, in the hope that his death might throw the state into enough disarray to halt, or at least delay, the conquest already underway. To carry out the assassination, Prince Dan recruited Jing Ke, a wandering swordsman and scholar described in ancient accounts as skilled, contemplative, and unusually calm in the face of near certain death. The plan required a plausible reason to gain direct, unsupervised access to the king, something Qin's court, understandably cautious given its military dominance and the enemies it had accumulated, would not grant easily. The solution devised was to offer King Zheng two objects considered valuable enough to justify a personal audience: the head of a Qin general who had defected to Yan and was now a wanted fugitive, offered as a gesture of loyalty, and a detailed map of the fertile Yan territory of Dukang, presented as a formal act of surrender. Hidden within the rolled map, according to tradition, was a poisoned dagger, small enough to remain concealed until the silk was fully unrolled before the king. The assassination attempt itself is recounted with striking, almost cinematic detail in the records of the Grand Historian. Detail specific enough that historians have long debated how much reflects an accurate eyewitness-adjacent account, passed down through court records, and how much reflects narrative embellishment added to heighten a story that was already, by any measure, dramatic enough on its own. As Jing Ke unrolled the map to its final section, the concealed dagger was revealed. He seized it and lunged at the king. What followed, according to the account, was not a swift, decisive strike, but a chaotic, almost absurd chase around a bronze pillar within the throne room itself. King Zheng scrambling to draw his own ceremonial sword, reportedly too long to unsheath quickly in the panic of the moment, while court officials, forbidden from carrying weapons in the king's presence under strict Qin law, could do little but watch in helpless confusion. The king's life, according to tradition, was ultimately saved by two small, almost incidental interventions. A royal physician present in the hall is said to have thrown his medicine bag at Jing Ke, disrupting his pursuit just long enough for the king to gain critical distance. And an official reportedly shouted for the king to swing his scabbard behind his back, altering the angle enough to finally draw the overlong sword. King Zheng, now armed, struck Jing Ke down, wounding him severely before guards finally arrived to finish what the king had started. Jing Ke, according to the account, died defiant, reportedly declaring that his failure stemmed only from his intention to capture rather than immediately kill the king, hoping, in some versions of the story, to force a treaty rather than simply commit murder. Is this vivid, almost theatrical sequence, the frantic chase around the pillar, the thrown medicine bag, the desperate advice to shift the scabbard, historically precise? Or does it reflect the kind of narrative polish that tends to accumulate around events significant enough to be retold for generations before being formally recorded? Sima Qian was writing roughly a century after the event, and while court records of an assassination attempt against a reigning monarch would almost certainly have been preserved in some form, the specific, almost novelistic details of the chase itself raise the same question we've encountered throughout much of Qin's history. Where does documented fact end, and where does the shaping hand of later storytelling begin? What isn't in serious dispute is the aftermath. King Zheng survived, and his response was immediate and severe. Qin forces accelerated their campaign against Yan, and within a few years, the state that had orchestrated the assassination attempt was conquered entirely, its royal family scattered or killed. Crown Prince Dan, the plot's architect, was eventually killed as well, reportedly by his own father in a desperate failed attempt to appease Qin's fury and delay the inevitable. Whatever chance the plot had of destabilizing Qin's momentum, it appears to have achieved the precise opposite, hardening King Zheng's resolve and accelerating exactly the conquest it was designed to prevent. There's a broader question worth sitting with here, one that extends beyond the specific mechanics of a single failed assassination. How differently might Chinese history have unfolded had that dagger found its mark? The empire Qin Huang would go on to build, the standardized script, currency, and roads, the Great Wall's early unification, the terracotta army, the very concept of a unified Chinese state under a single emperor, all of it depended on one man surviving a chaotic scramble around a bronze pillar, saved by a thrown medicine bag and a shouted piece of advice about how to draw an overlong sword. Historians have long treated this moment as one of history's genuine turning points. A single afternoon on which an enormous, still unwritten future balanced on details almost too small and too human to belong in the story of an empire. Was Jinkei's failure simply bad fortune, a plot undone by nothing more than a sword drawn a few seconds too late? Or does the survival of King Zheng, against odds that seem, in hindsight, genuinely narrow, suggest something closer to the kind of moment later dynasties love to retroactively frame as fated, destiny disguised as chance, an empire's entire future resting for a few frantic seconds on the length of a blade its own ceremonial law had made too long to reach in time? Some empires end in a single afternoon of chaos. Others take decades to unravel, each year adding one more thread to a collapse that, in hindsight, looks almost inevitable, even though nearly everyone living through it seemed certain, until the very end, that recovery was still possible. Picture the Imperial Palace at Chang'an in October of AD 23, its halls no longer filled with the ordered ceremony that had once characterized Han rule, but with the sounds of a city under siege, rebel forces closing in on a capital that had, only 15 years earlier, been the center of what its founder genuinely believed would be a restored golden age. Inside, an aging emperor named Wang Mang, the same regent we've already traced through the suspicious death of young Emperor Ping, prepared for what would become the final hours of a dynasty that had existed for scarcely more than a decade and a half. To understand how completely this collapse contradicted its beginning, it helps to remember how Wang Mang's rise had actually unfolded. Following Emperor Ping's death in AD 6, and after a brief period ruling through an infant successor, Wang Mang formally declared the end of the Han dynasty in AD 9, founding his own Xin, or New, dynasty, and positioning himself not as a usurper in the traditional sense, but as a reformer specifically chosen by heaven to correct what he genuinely seems to have believed were centuries of accumulated injustice within the Han system. This distinction matters. Many of history's dynastic founders seized power through straightforward military conquest. Wang Mang, by contrast, built his legitimacy on an elaborate framework of omens, ancient texts, and what he presented as a return to idealized principles drawn from the earliest, most revered periods of Chinese history, including specific practices he attributed to the Zhou dynasty. His reforms, once in power, were sweeping almost to the point of recklessness. He nationalized land, attempting to abolish private ownership of large estates and redistribute holdings more equitably, a policy that directly threatened the wealthy landowning families whose cooperation any stable government required. He restructured the currency multiple times, introducing new coinage systems that historians generally agree caused significant economic disruption and public confusion, undermining the very financial stability the reforms were meant to strengthen. He renamed government offices and administrative divisions according to ancient, sometimes obscure precedents, changes that many officials and common people alike appear to have found bewildering rather than inspiring. Individually, each reform reflected a coherent, even principled vision. Collectively, implemented rapidly and without sufficient regard for how they interacted with an already strained economy and bureaucracy, they appear to have destabilized nearly every major institution Wang Mang needed functioning smoothly to maintain control. Nature, according to the historical record, offered no cooperation during this fragile period. The Yellow River, whose floods and course changes had shaped Chinese history since long before the semi-legendary era of Yu the Great, shifted dramatically sometime around AD 11, breaking its banks and altering its path in a way that devastated agricultural regions already strained by Wang Mang's currency instability and land reforms. Famine followed in several provinces, and with famine came the conditions under which organized rebellion tends to take root. Desperate populations with nothing left to lose, and increasingly little loyalty to a government whose reforms had, whatever their original intentions, failed to protect them from catastrophe. This is the environment in which two of the era's most significant rebel movements emerged. The Red Eyebrows, a peasant uprising named for the distinctive marking rebels reportedly painted on their faces to distinguish themselves from Xia Dynasty soldiers in battle, gathered strength primarily among famine-stricken populations in the east. Separately, remnants and descendants of the Han Imperial family, along with disaffected nobility who had lost standing under Wang Mang's reforms, began organizing their own resistance, framing their rebellion not merely as opposition to failed policy, but as the rightful restoration of a dynasty that had been unjustly displaced. By AD 23, these separate pressures had converged catastrophically. Rebel forces associated with the Han Restoration movement won a decisive victory at the Battle of Kunyang, a battle that ancient accounts describe in terms bordering on the supernatural, citing violent storms, meteor sightings, and other unusual atmospheric phenomena coinciding with the fighting, details historians generally treat as symbolic embellishment reflecting how thoroughly contemporaries understood Kunyang as a turning point, rather than literal meteorological record. Whatever actually occurred on that battlefield, the practical outcome is undisputed. Wang Mang's most capable remaining military forces were destroyed, and the road to Chang'an lay open. What followed inside the capital, as rebel forces closed in, is where the historical record grows genuinely strange, less because the sources disagree about basic facts, and more because Wang Mang's own recorded behavior in his final days resists easy categorization. According to the Book of Han, rather than attempting to flee the capital or negotiate surrender, Wang Mang retreated to a ceremonial platform, engaging in ritual practices and invoking heaven's mandate even as the city collapsed around him, seemingly convinced, or at least performing conviction, that cosmic legitimacy might yet reverse a military and political catastrophe that had already become irreversible. Is this a portrait of genuine, almost tragic religious sincerity, a ruler so committed to his own theory of divine legitimacy that he could not process its practical failure, even as the evidence surrounded him? Or is it a portrait shaped once again by Han Dynasty historians with every incentive to depict the man who briefly displaced their dynasty as detached from reality in his final hours, reinforcing the narrative that heaven's mandate had rightfully abandoned him? Wang Mang was killed when the palace finally fell, his death described in various accounts with a level of violent detail, his body reportedly dismembered by the mob that overwhelmed the palace. That itself raises the same interpretive question we've encountered throughout Xin and Han history. How much reflects documented fact, and how much reflects the symbolic thoroughness with which later chroniclers wanted his fall remembered, a punishment severe enough to match the scale of what they considered his usurpation? What makes the Xia dynasty's collapse particularly worth sitting with, within this broader exploration, isn't any single unexplained event, but rather the strange compression of the whole story. An empire that Wang Mang seems to have genuinely believed was correcting centuries of injustice, built on ancient precedent and sincere reformist conviction, lasted barely 15 years before collapsing under the combined weight of economic disruption, natural disaster, and rebellion, dissolving so completely that the restored Han dynasty that followed treated the entire Xin period less as a legitimate chapter of Chinese history, and more as an aberration to be corrected and largely written out of the continuous narrative. Was Wang Mang a genuine idealist, undone by reforms too ambitious and too rapid for the fragile system meant to carry them, compounded by natural disasters no ruler could have controlled? Or does the sheer speed of the Xia dynasty's collapse suggest something else, that Wang Mang's rule was never as stable or as widely accepted as his own court proclamations claimed? A foundation of borrowed legitimacy that only ever needed the right combination of famine, flood, and rebellion to reveal how little was actually holding it together. Somewhere between sincere reform and catastrophic miscalculation, a dynasty that believed it was restoring an ancient golden age instead became, within a single generation, one of Chinese history's most thoroughly erased cautionary tales. Not every succession in ancient Chinese history was contested by force, poison, or forged decrees. According to the oldest and most revered tradition, one transfer of power stands apart from everything we've examined so far: a peaceful, voluntary abdication between two sage kings, celebrated for millennia as the model of what virtuous rule was supposed to look like. And yet even this story, the gentlest one in China's founding mythology, carries a second, darker version buried within its own textual history, one that has quietly unsettled scholars for centuries. Picture the region of Kangwu, in the far south of what is now Hunan province, near the Xiang River, where local tradition places the final resting place of a ruler known as Emperor Shun. A modest shrine and burial mound have stood there for centuries, tended across dynasties as the reputed tomb of one of the most celebrated figures in Chinese legendary history. According to the earliest surviving accounts, Shun died here, far from the capital, at the end of an extraordinarily long life devoted to virtuous governance. But the question of exactly how and under what circumstances he came to die so far from home is where the traditional narrative begins to fracture. To understand why this matters, we need to return to the beginning of Shun's story, and to a concept that would go on to shape Chinese political philosophy for the next 3,000 years. The idea of abdication to the worthy, rather than succession by bloodline. According to the records of the grand historian and earlier classical texts, including portions of the Book of Documents, Shun was not born into royal lineage. He rose from humble origins, distinguished by extraordinary filial devotion to a difficult family, and by a reputation for wisdom and moral discipline that eventually reached the reigning sage king before him, Yao. Rather than passing the throne to his own son, whom he reportedly judged unfit to rule, Yao is said to have tested Shun over many years, assigning him increasingly difficult responsibilities, even marrying two of his own daughters to him as a further trial of character, before ultimately choosing him as successor over his own bloodline. This decision, framed by later Confucian tradition as the purest possible expression of virtuous governance, placing merit above hereditary privilege, became one of the most cited moral examples in all of subsequent Chinese political thought. Shun's own reign, according to tradition, followed the same pattern when it came time for him to choose his own successor. Rather than elevating his son, Shun is said to have selected Yu, the same figure credited in later tradition with taming the Great Flood and founding the Xia Dynasty we explored earlier in this series, choosing him for his competence and moral character over any claim of hereditary right. This chain, Yao to Shun, Shun to Yu, forms the philosophical foundation of what Confucian scholars would later call the abdication system, held up for millennia as proof that ancient China's earliest and most legendary rulers had governed not through force or lineage, but through voluntary virtue-based succession. It's a beautiful story. It's also, according to at least one significant ancient source, not entirely true. The complication comes from the Bamboo Annals, a chronicle whose own history is itself something of a mystery worth pausing on. Believed to have been compiled during the Warring States period, the text was buried in a tomb, reportedly sealed sometime around 296 BC, and remained lost for over 5 centuries before being rediscovered in AD 279, when tomb robbers broke into the burial site of a king from the state of Wei and stumbled upon a cache of ancient bamboo strips, among them a chronicle of Chinese history that, in several key places, directly contradicts the far more widely known accounts preserved in texts like the records of the Grand Historian. According to fragments and later citations attributed to the Bamboo Annals, the abdication of Yao to Shun was not the voluntary, harmonious transfer of power that classical tradition describes. Instead, the text suggests that Shun effectively seized power, confining Yao and preventing him from being reunited with his own son, consolidating control through what amounts to a soft coup dressed in the language of virtue by the historians who came later. And more strikingly still, some versions of the Bamboo Annals tradition suggest that Shun's own transfer of power to Yu followed a disturbingly similar pattern, with Yu ultimately exiling Shun rather than peacefully receiving the throne from him, and that Shun's death in the distant region of Kangwu, far from the traditional centers of power, may not have been the peaceful conclusion of an elder statesman's final journey at all, but something closer to banishment, a sage king pushed to the furthest edges of the known world and left to die there, out of sight and out of reach. This is, understandably, a difficult claim to evaluate. The bamboo annals survive today only in fragmentary form, and their transmission history is genuinely complicated. The version of the text widely circulated for centuries after its rediscovery was later determined by scholars to be at least partially a forgery, reconstructed and embellished sometime during the Jin dynasty or after, mixing genuine ancient material with later invention in ways that remain difficult to fully untangle, even with modern textual analysis. Some passages attributed to the current text version of the Bamboo Annals are now considered largely unreliable. But other fragments, quoted independently in various texts written before the original bamboo strips were lost again during later periods of turmoil, appear to preserve genuinely ancient material that predates and directly contradicts the far more polished Confucian narrative of peaceful abdication. Why would two such fundamentally different accounts of the same succession exist at all? The most widely accepted explanation among modern historians centers on the political and philosophical needs of the different eras in which these texts were shaped. The records of the Grand Historian, along with the classical Confucian tradition it draws from, was compiled and popularized during periods when the ideal of virtuous, merit-based succession carried enormous moral and political weight, offering a founding precedent that later rulers, dynasties, and philosophers could invoke to argue for their own legitimacy, or to critique rulers who fell short of this ancient standard. A version of history in which China's earliest, most revered sage kings achieved power through peaceful, voluntary transfer served this philosophical project extraordinarily well. A version in which those same sage kings achieved power through confinement, exile, and quiet coercion would have undermined the very moral foundation Confucian political philosophy was built upon. Under this reading, the Bamboo Annals tradition may represent an older, less philosophically curated account, closer to whatever political reality actually existed in China's earliest, semi-legendary period, before centuries of Confucian scholarship had the opportunity to smooth its rougher edges into a more instructive moral parable. This doesn't necessarily mean the Bamboo Annals version is more historically accurate in any documentable sense. We're dealing with events, if they occurred at all in any form resembling either account, from a period so early that it predates confirmed writing systems in China entirely, closer to the semi-mythical era of the Yellow Emperor than to the more archaeologically grounded Shang dynasty. But the existence of this second tradition complicates any simple acceptance of the abdication story as straightforward historical fact, rather than as a moral narrative constructed, at least in part, sometime after the events it claims to describe. There's a particular detail within the Kangwu tradition that deserves attention here because it exists somewhat independently of either succession narrative and offers a small, strange thread of its own. According to some accounts, Shun's two wives, the daughters of Zhao, who had been given to him in marriage as part of his original testing, followed him south when he traveled to Kangwu, and upon learning of his death there, are said to have wept so profoundly along the banks of the Shang River that their tears permanently stained the local bamboo, giving rise to a distinctive spotted variety still associated with the region in later poetry and legend, sometimes still called Shangfei bamboo, or bamboo of the Shang consorts. Some versions of the story go further, suggesting the two women eventually drowned themselves in the river out of grief, becoming, in later Chinese religious tradition, goddesses associated with the Shang River itself. Whether this detail reflects genuine ancient folklore, later poetic embellishment layered onto an already legendary figure, or some blend of both, it adds an emotional weight to Shun's story that neither the peaceful abdication narrative nor the darker exile tradition fully accounts for on its own. Whatever actually happened to Shun in Kangwu, the story that grew around his death was significant enough to shape regional folklore, poetry, and religious tradition for well over 2,000 years afterward. What we're left with, ultimately, is a founding story that occupies an unusual position within this broader exploration. Unlike the Xia dynasty's uncertain archaeological footprint or the debated identity of the Yellow Emperor, Shun's story was never primarily about proving whether a physical person existed. It was about establishing a moral template, a story China told itself about how power was supposed to change hands in its most idealized form. And yet buried within that very story, preserved in fragments recovered from a looted tomb over 1,000 years after the fact, is a second contradictory version, suggesting that even China's most celebrated example of peaceful succession may have been peaceful only in the way later generations needed it to have been, rather than in the way it may have genuinely occurred. Did Emperor Shun truly abdicate his throne willingly, choosing merit over bloodline in an act of selfless wisdom that would inspire Chinese political philosophy for 3,000 years afterward? Or did he, like so many rulers we've examined throughout this exploration, simply lose a quieter, less documented struggle for power, exiled to the farthest edge of the known world and left to die there? His true fate smoothed over by scholars centuries later, who needed China's founding succession to look nothing like the coups and conspiracies that would follow in every dynasty afterward. Somewhere along the banks of the Zheng River, beneath a mound tended for over 2,000 years by people who may never have known which version of the story was true, an answer may still wait, if it exists at all, in a form no rediscovered bamboo strip has yet been able to fully confirm. A folded silk sleeve, cut cleanly with a blade, is one of the strangest objects to survive in the historical memory of the Han Dynasty. Not because of what it was, but because of what its destruction was said to reveal about the man who ordered it cut. Picture the private quarters of the Han Imperial Palace in Chang'an, sometime in the final years of the 1st century BC. Emperor Ai, the 11th ruler of the Western Han Dynasty, is said to have woken one afternoon to find a young palace official named Dongxian asleep beside him, his own sleeve trapped beneath the other man's body. Rather than wake him, the emperor is said to have called for a blade and quietly cut his own sleeve free, sparing Dongxian's rest rather than disturb him. The story survives in the Book of Han as the origin of a lasting idiom in Chinese literary tradition, duanshu, the cut sleeve, used for centuries afterward as an elegant euphemism for a relationship between men. It's a small, oddly tender detail buried inside the record of a reign that would end suddenly, suspiciously, and far too young, only a handful of years later. To understand why Emperor Ai's death remains genuinely debated, it helps to understand just how unusual and how consequential his relationship with Dongxian actually was within the rigid structure of Han court politics. Emperor Ai came to the throne in 7 BC, inheriting an empire already weakened by the kind of institutional strain we've traced through several chapters of this exploration. Powerful consort clans jockeying for influence, a court bureaucracy increasingly hollowed out by factional competition, and an imperial family whose internal stability had been fraying for generations since the height of Han power. Ai himself was a young ruler, in poor health for much of his reign according to multiple historical accounts, a detail that will matter considerably by the end of this story. Early in his reign, Ai became deeply attached to Dongxian, a minor court official whose rise under the emperor's favor was, even by the standards of Han patronage, extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily controversial. Within a few short years, Dongxian was elevated to some of the highest positions available in the entire imperial bureaucracy, eventually appointed commander-in-chief, one of the most powerful military and administrative titles in the empire, a position typically reserved for seasoned officials or trusted senior relatives of the throne, not a young favorite whose primary qualification, as far as the surviving record indicates, was the emperor's personal affection. The Book of Han describes gifts on a scale that alarmed even contemporary officials. Enormous grants of land, and residence built to rival the emperor's own palace in scale and luxury, and honors extended not only to Dongxian himself, but to his entire family. Some accounts go further still, describing a moment near the end of Ai's reign when the emperor, reportedly during a banquet, half-jokingly raised the possibility of abdicating the throne directly to Dongxian, following the ancient precedent of virtuous abdication we explored in the previous chapter through the story of Yao and Shun, rather than passing the throne through conventional succession. Whether this was a genuine proposal or an impulsive remark exaggerated by later chroniclers eager to illustrate the emperor's recklessness, the suggestion alone was reportedly enough to alarm senior officials, who intervened forcefully enough that the idea was never pursued. This is the political environment in which Emperor Ai died, suddenly, in 1 BC, at only 25 years old. The official historical record offers little detail about the immediate cause of death, a notable gap given how specifically some of the other deaths in this series, Emperor Ping's poisoned wine, Han Xin's bamboo staves, have been documented. The Book of Han records the death itself and moves relatively quickly to what followed, which is, in many ways, where the deeper mystery of this chapter actually lives. Within days of Ai's death, the political landscape at court transformed with startling speed. Empress Dowager Wang, matriarch of the powerful Wang clan and mother of the previous emperor, moved immediately to seize the imperial seal and summon her nephew, Mang, back to court, the same man whose later regency, reforms, and eventual founding of the short-lived Xia Dynasty we've already traced across multiple chapters of this exploration. Dongxian, stripped almost instantly of the military authority Ai had granted him, was removed from his position within hours of the emperor's death being confirmed. Facing arrest and the seizure of his family's vast holdings, Dongxian and his wife are reported to have taken their own lives together shortly afterward, their household's fortune confiscated by the state. The speed of this transition is what invites the most serious scholarly questions. Political successions in Han history, as we've seen throughout this series, could certainly move quickly once a ruler's death was confirmed. But the specific choreography here, the Wang clan's near-immediate seizure of the seal, Wang Mang's swift return to power, Dongxian's almost instantaneous fall from the empire's second most powerful position to a forced suicide within what appears to have been a matter of days, suggests a level of preparation that some historians argue could not plausibly have been assembled after Ai's death alone. Was this simply the practiced efficiency of a powerful clan that had held court influence for generations and knew precisely how to move the moment an opportunity arose? Or does the speed itself suggest that Ai's death, whatever its true medical cause, may not have come as a surprise to everyone in the palace? No historical source directly accuses Empress Dowager Wang or her clan of poisoning or otherwise hastening Ai's death, a notable contrast to the direct accusation Bangu was willing to make against Wang Mang regarding Emperor Ping's death, which we examined earlier in this series. This absence of direct accusation matters, and cuts in two different directions depending on how much weight a historian places on it. It could suggest that Ai's death was, in fact, understood at the time as a natural event, consistent with the poor health repeatedly attributed to him throughout his reign, and that the rapid political transition that followed reflects preparation rather than orchestration, the Wang clan simply ready to act the moment illness finally claimed a ruler everyone understood to be fragile. Or it could suggest something more uncomfortable, that whatever happened in Ai's final days occurred within a court controlled tightly enough, by a clan powerful enough, that no historian, even one writing generations later under a restored dynasty with every reason to criticize the periods that came before it, felt safe enough, or had sufficient evidence, to record an accusation that a poisoning accusation against Wang Mang himself, in the very next reign, apparently didn't carry the same risk to make. There's an additional layer worth considering here, one connected directly to Dongxian's unprecedented rise. Ai's extraordinary elevation of a personal favorite to the empire's second highest military office had already alienated much of the established court bureaucracy well before his death. Senior officials, generals, and members of rival consort families had genuine institutional reasons to want Dongxian removed from power, independent of whatever role, if any, they may have played in the timing of the emperor's death itself. Under this reading, the swiftness of Dongxian's fall may simply reflect the depth of resentment his rise had already generated across the court. Resentment that required no conspiracy to explain, only an emperor's death removing the one source of protection that had kept these tensions contained. What makes Emperor Ai's death particularly difficult to resolve, compared to some of the more clearly documented conspiracies we've traced elsewhere in this series, is the almost complete absence of the kind of specific, damning detail that tends to anchor these mysteries. No named suspect, no described poison, no dramatic confrontation preserved in the record. Instead, what survives is something quieter, and in its own way, more unsettling. A sudden death, a young emperor with a documented history of poor health, and a political transition executed with a precision that historians have never fully been able to attribute with confidence to either coincidence or design. Did Emperor Ai simply succumb to the illness that had shadowed much of his brief reign, his death arriving at a moment convenient enough for the Wang clan's ambitions that later generations have mistaken good timing for deliberate action? Or did a court already deeply unsettled by an emperor's reckless devotion to a single favored official find a quieter, better concealed way to resolve a succession crisis that direct confrontation could never have safely achieved? Somewhere in the gap between a documented history of fragile health and the suspicious efficiency of what followed, Emperor Ai's death remains one of the rare mysteries in this exploration where even the historians closest to the event, writing within a generation or two, seem to have chosen silence over speculation, leaving behind a story built almost entirely out of what happened next, rather than anything resembling an answer to what actually happened that day. We've now watched Mang from several different vantage points in this exploration, as the regent suspected of poisoning a 14-year-old emperor, as the founder of a dynasty whose reforms still divide historians, as the ruler whose fall came as swiftly and completely as his rise. But we have not yet asked the most basic question of all. Who was this man before any of it began, and what in his early life might explain how he came to hold so much power in the first place? Picture the household compound of the Wang clan in the closing decades of the 2nd century BC, a family whose name would eventually define, and then nearly erase itself from, an entire chapter of Chinese imperial history. Unlike many of the ambitious men who maneuver through the deaths and conspiracies we've already traced, Mang did not begin his life as an obvious contender for power. He was, by most accounts, a relatively minor branch of a family that had already achieved extraordinary prominence through one specific decisive stroke of fortune. His aunt, Wang Zhengjun, had become Empress Consort to Emperor Yuan, and later Empress Dowager, elevating the entire Wang clan into the highest tier of Han court politics almost overnight. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Much of Mang's later authority depended not on personal military conquest or dramatic political maneuvering in his early years, but on the accumulated institutional weight of an extended family that had positioned multiple members in powerful court and military offices, largely on the strength of a single marriage, 2 generations removed from Mang's own achievements. Several of his uncles held significant positions during this period, commanding armies, overseeing key administrative offices, and generally functioning as the practical power behind an increasingly ceremonial imperial throne. Mang, by contrast, spent much of his youth in comparative modesty, a detail that both the Book of Han and Mang's own later political messaging would return to repeatedly, though for very different reasons. According to Bangu's account, Mang's father died relatively young, before achieving the kind of prominent office his brothers secured, leaving Mang's branch of the family in a noticeably less privileged position than his more powerful cousins. Rather than resenting this, or according to the traditional narrative at least, Mang is described as responding with unusual discipline, dedicating himself to Confucian scholarship, living modestly despite his family's broader wealth, and cultivating a reputation for filial devotion, particularly toward an uncle who had fallen seriously ill, a period during which Mang is said to have personally tended to him with a level of attentive care that impressed the wider court and helped establish his early reputation as a young man of unusual moral seriousness. Is this portrait accurate, or is it, like so much of what we know about Mang, shaped by the specific political needs of the moment in which it was recorded? This is where the question of Mang's true origins becomes genuinely complicated, because unlike most of the mysteries in this series, the uncertainty here isn't primarily about missing information. It's about competing versions of the same information, each shaped by dramatically different political agendas, separated by little more than a few decades. During Wang Mang's own rise to power, particularly in the years building toward his eventual founding of the Xia Dynasty, accounts of his humble discipline and moral virtue appear to have been actively cultivated, whether through genuine reputation or careful political messaging, as part of a broader narrative establishing him as uniquely qualified, by character rather than birthright, to eventually receive heaven's mandate. Ancient Chinese political culture placed enormous weight on precisely this kind of narrative. A ruler's legitimacy was frequently built as much on demonstrated virtue as on lineage or military accomplishment. And Wang Mang's early biography, Modest Origins Overcome Through Discipline and Moral Seriousness, fits this template with a precision that itself raises questions. Was Wang Mang genuinely the unusually virtuous young man these accounts describe? Or does the suspicious neatness of this narrative suggest a story shaped, at least in part, by a man who understood exactly what kind of origin story his eventual ambitions would require? The version of Wang Mang's early life preserved in the Book of Han, however, was compiled generations later, under a restored Han dynasty with an entirely different and largely opposite political incentive. For Bangu and the historians working within his tradition, Wang Mang needed to be remembered not as a genuinely virtuous man whose reforms simply failed under difficult circumstances, but as a calculating usurper whose apparent virtue, even in his youth, was itself evidence of long-cultivated deception, a portrait of ambition so patient and so carefully constructed that it had been operating, according to this reading, since Wang Mang was barely more than a teenager, tending to a sick uncle with an eye already fixed on the throne decades in the future. Both of these narratives cannot be fully true simultaneously, and modern historians have generally treated each with appropriate caution, recognizing that the genuine sage and lifelong schemer framings likely both contain elements of retrospective narrative construction, layered onto whatever the actual, far less dramatic truth of a young man's early adulthood in a powerful but not yet supremely dominant branch of a prominent family actually looked like. There's a specific incident from Wang Mang's early career that illustrates this interpretive difficulty particularly well. According to several accounts, Wang Mang's rise within official court positions accelerated noticeably following the death of one of his uncles, Wang Feng, whom Wang Mang had reportedly nursed with exceptional devotion during a prolonged illness. On his deathbed, Wang Feng is said to have specifically recommended his nephew for advancement, an endorsement that carried significant weight given Wang Feng's own position as one of the most powerful men at court. Read one way, this is simply the natural reward of genuine familial devotion, a young man's real character recognized and rewarded by an uncle who had directly witnessed it. Read another way, it's the first clearly documented instance of a pattern that would repeat throughout Wang Mang's career, cultivating personal loyalty and dependence in powerful figures, then leveraging their trust and eventually their absence to advance his own position. Both readings rely on precisely the same underlying facts. What differs entirely is the motive attributed to them, and that motive is something the historical record, regardless of which version we consult, simply cannot verify from the outside. This pattern of dual interpretation extends even further back into questions about Wang Mang's education and early intellectual formation. He's consistently described as a serious, committed student of Confucian classics, at a time when Confucian scholarship was increasingly influential, though not yet as singularly dominant within Han court ideology as it would become in later centuries. Some modern historians have suggested that Wang Mang's particular emphasis on very ancient, sometimes obscure classical precedents, the same emphasis that would later shape his controversial land reforms and administrative renaming during his actual reign, may have been genuinely unusual even among his Confucian contemporaries, reflecting a specific, idiosyncratic reading of antiquity that he appears to have held with real conviction throughout his life, rather than adopting merely as convenient political cover once he approached the throne. If this is accurate, it suggests something worth taking seriously. That whatever else Wang Mang may have been, calculating, patient, ultimately catastrophic as a ruler, his underlying belief in a very particular idealized vision of ancient governance may have been genuine, formed decades before he held any power to act on it, rather than invented retroactively to justify ambitions that came later. If that's true, it reframes the entire question of Wang Mang's origins in an unsettling way. It would mean that the reforms which eventually destabilized an empire, and the reputation for early virtue that helped him acquire the power to attempt them, may not represent two separate stories, one sincere and one calculated, but a single, continuous thread. A young man who genuinely believed from an early age in a specific idealized vision of what Chinese governance was supposed to look like, who spent decades patiently acquiring the position necessary to attempt it, and who never, in his own mind, distinguished between personal ambition and moral obligation, because he may never have experienced them as separate impulses at all. This is, admittedly, a more difficult and less satisfying conclusion than either of the two clean narratives handed down to us, the humble sage undone by circumstance, or the calculating villain whose virtue was theater from the very beginning. But the genuine uncertainty at the heart of Wang Mang's early life may be the most historically honest place this particular mystery can settle. We know the institutional facts of his rise reasonably well, the family connections, the offices held, the uncle's deathbed endorsement. What we cannot know, and what perhaps no historical record could ever definitively establish about any figure operating this far back in time, is what was actually happening inside the mind of a modest, disciplined young scholar decades before anyone, including possibly Wang Mang himself, could have known what he would eventually become. Was Wang Mang always the man history would later either celebrate or condemn, his final, catastrophic reign simply the fullest expression of convictions he had held quietly since childhood? Or did decades of proximity to power, accumulated gradually and almost accidentally through family connection rather than personal design, slowly transform a genuinely modest young man into someone capable of exactly the ambition his later critics accused him of harboring from the start? Somewhere in a household compound whose exact location no longer survives in any confirmable form, a boy who would eventually declare himself the founder of a new dynasty grew up largely unremarked upon by the historical record, leaving behind only two irreconcilable stories about who he truly was, each shaped more by what came after than by anything anyone actually witnessed at the time. Some falls come from ambition, others from calculation or from circumstances no ruler could have controlled. This one, according to the oldest surviving accounts, came from a smile, or more precisely, from one king's obsession with provoking it, at a cost that would eventually consume his entire dynasty. Picture a chain of signal beacon towers stretching along the mountains surrounding Haojing, the western capital of the Zhou dynasty, sometime in the closing years of the 9th century BC, though the precise year remains debated. These towers, built along a defensive network designed to warn of approaching enemies, formed one of the earliest large-scale early warning systems in recorded Chinese history. Their purpose was singular and deadly serious. When danger approached the capital, watchmen would light signal fires, each tower relaying the warning to the next, summoning loyal lords and their armies to the king's defense faster than any messenger could travel on horseback. It was a system built entirely on trust, on the certainty that when those fires burned, the threat was real. According to one of ancient China's most enduring cautionary tales, King Yu of Zhou destroyed that trust deliberately, repeatedly, for the amusement of a single woman, and in doing so, brought an entire dynasty to its knees. According to the records of the grand historian, King Yu became infatuated with a concubine named Bao Si, a woman described in ancient texts with a curious, specific detail. She rarely, if ever, smiled. Where most court legends of this era focus on a ruler's excessive indulgence in wine, luxury, or political favoritism, the story of King Yu centers on something stranger and more particular, an obsessive desire to see one specific expression on one specific woman's face, and the increasingly reckless lengths a king was reportedly willing to go to produce it. Various methods, according to tradition, were attempted and failed. Then, according to the account preserved by Sima Qian, someone at court suggested lighting the signal beacons, summoning the loyal lords and their armies to the capital under false pretense of invasion. When the assembled nobles arrived to find no enemy, only a confused, mobilized court and a king who had deceived them for sport, Baozi is said to have finally, genuinely smiled, watching the chaos and humiliation unfold below. King Yu, delighted by this result, is said to have repeated the deception multiple times afterward, lighting the beacons again and again purely to recreate the sight of her amusement, each time summoning armies that arrived to find nothing waiting for them but their own foolishness. The consequences of this pattern, according to the traditional account, proved catastrophic. King Yu had also, around this same period, made a deeply destabilizing decision regarding his own succession, setting aside his original queen and her son, the crown prince, in favor of Baozi and the son she had borne him. The displaced queen's father, a powerful lord named Marquis Shen, allied himself with a neighboring group of northern peoples, the Quanrong, and moved against the Zhou capital directly, seeking to restore his grandson's rightful claim to the throne. When the attack finally came, genuine and overwhelming, King Yu reportedly ordered the beacons lit one final time. According to the traditional story, no one came. The lords who had been deceived so many times before, according to this account, simply assumed the latest signal was another cruel game, and the capital fell with catastrophic speed. King Yu killed in the chaos, the western capital sacked, and the Zhou court forced to relocate its seat of power eastward, marking the transition from what historians call the Western Zhou period into the Eastern Zhou, a shift so significant that it's traditionally treated as one of the defining turning points in early Chinese political history. It's a remarkably tidy story, moral cause leading directly to catastrophic effect, a king's personal recklessness translating with almost mathematical precision into the fall of an entire dynasty's western capital. And it's precisely this tidiness that has led modern historians to examine the account with considerably more skepticism than many of the more institutionally documented conspiracies we've traced elsewhere in this series. The most significant challenge to the traditional narrative comes from a source we've already encountered in this exploration: the Bamboo Annals, the same chronicle whose fragmentary, sometimes forged, but occasionally genuinely ancient content complicated our understanding of Emperor Shun's succession several chapters ago. Versions of the Bamboo Annals tradition describing the fall of King Yu differ from Sima Qian's account in a crucial way, omitting the beacon fire deception entirely and instead framing the conflict in more straightforward political terms. A succession dispute between rival claimants, escalating into open warfare with external allies, without requiring a manipulative concubine or a king's reckless obsession with provoking a smile to explain the underlying collapse. This discrepancy matters considerably because the beacon fire system itself presents a genuine, somewhat technical, historical problem that scholars have raised independently of any textual disagreement. Some historians studying the development of early Chinese military communication systems have questioned whether a beacon network sophisticated enough to summon distant lords with the described speed and reliability actually existed in fully developed form this early in the Western Zhou period, or whether such systems developed more gradually over the following centuries, reaching the level of sophistication the King Yu story assumes only well after the events it claims to describe. If the beacon system as described didn't yet exist in this precise form, the entire mechanism of the story, repeated false alarms eroding trust until a genuine crisis goes unanswered, becomes difficult to sustain as literal historical fact, regardless of whether some kind of political and military collapse genuinely occurred around this period. This raises the same question that has surfaced repeatedly throughout this exploration, in different forms, across nearly every chapter. If the beacon fire deception may not be literally accurate, what function does the story actually serve within the broader tradition that preserved it? The most widely accepted explanation among modern historians treats the Baozi narrative as a moralizing parable, constructed or substantially embellished sometime after the actual fall of the Western Zhou capital, using the familiar, culturally resonant trope of a ruler destabilized by obsessive infatuation with a woman to explain a political and military collapse, whose actual causes were likely more mundane and considerably less narratively satisfying. Succession disputes, weakened central authority, and growing external pressure from peoples along the Zhou frontier. Factors that don't require any individual's personal recklessness to produce a genuine, historically plausible collapse. And yet, dismissing the story entirely risks its own kind of oversimplification. Ancient Chinese historiography frequently used personal moralized narratives, a king's specific vice, a specific betrayed trust, a specific fatal indulgence, as a kind of shorthand for describing structural political failures that would have been considerably harder to explain in purely institutional terms to audiences centuries removed from the original events. Under this reading, the beacon fire story may not be historically literal, but it may still preserve something genuinely important about how the Zhou court's authority eroded, that trust between the king and his lords had been damaged repeatedly and severely enough, whatever the actual mechanism, that when a genuine crisis arrived, the traditional systems of loyalty and mutual defense that should have protected the capital simply failed to function as intended. Whether that failure came from repeated false alarms lit for a concubine's amusement, or from years of accumulated political grievance expressed through more conventional means, the underlying lesson that a ruler's credibility, once sufficiently exhausted, cannot be relied upon in the moment it's needed most, may capture something true about the Western Zhou's collapse, even if the specific beacon fire mechanism never happened exactly as later generations chose to remember it. There's also the question of Baoxi herself, a figure who exists almost entirely as an instrument within someone else's cautionary story, rather than as a documented historical individual in her own right. Almost nothing in the surviving record describes her origins, her own perspective, or her life beyond the role assigned to her within King Yu's narrative of obsession and downfall. This absence is itself worth noting, a pattern that recurs throughout much of ancient Chinese historical writing, in which women positioned at the center of a dynasty's collapse are frequently rendered almost entirely through the lens of the destruction attributed to their influence, with little space given to who they may have actually been as individuals navigating a court that, in this case at least, ultimately blamed her for a catastrophe that a king's own political decisions had done considerably more to bring about. What remains, finally, is a story whose emotional and moral shape has survived far more securely across nearly 3,000 years than its literal historical accuracy. We know with reasonable confidence that the Western Zhou capital fell sometime around 771 BC, that a genuine military and succession crisis was involved, and that the Zhou court's subsequent relocation eastward marked a real, significant, well-documented turning point in early Chinese political history. What we cannot know with the same confidence is whether a beacon fire system sophisticated enough to be repeatedly abused for a concubine's amusement actually existed in the form later chroniclers described, or whether King Yu's obsession with provoking a single smile genuinely set catastrophe into motion, rather than serving as a vivid, memorable explanation constructed after the fact for a collapse whose real causes were rooted in the kind of gradual, structural political erosion that rarely makes for as compelling a story. Did an entire dynasty's western capital truly fall because a king exhausted his own lord's trust chasing one woman's rare smile, lighting warning fires meant to save his kingdom until the one time it mattered most? No one believed him. Or has one of ancient China's most memorable cautionary tales survived for nearly 3,000 years? Not because it accurately describes what happened, but because it offered every generation that retold it exactly the kind of clear, human-scaled explanation that a slower, more structural collapse of royal authority could never quite provide on its own. Not every collapse takes an empire down with it. Sometimes what falls is a single extraordinary life, cut short at the height of its promise, leaving behind a monument built not to explain a mystery, but to guard against one being forgotten. Picture the burial mound of General Qubing, rising from the flat earth near Maoling, the mausoleum complex built for Emperor Wu of Han, roughly 80 kilometers northwest of modern Xi'an. Unlike the more famous, more elaborate tomb of Qin Shi Huang we explored earlier in this series, Qubing's mound was deliberately shaped to resemble Qilian Mountain, a specific range in the far northwest where the general had won some of his most decisive victories. Stone sculptures still stand at the site today, weathered but recognizable after more than 2,000 years, including the famous depiction of a horse trampling a fallen enemy soldier, widely regarded as one of the finest surviving examples of Han Dynasty stone carving. This was not a burial designed for a man who died quietly of old age. It was designed for a warrior, and the location, the shape of the mound itself, the imagery carved into stone, all point toward a single, unavoidable fact. Qubing died at the absolute height of his military career, at only 23 years old, and the empire that mourned him never fully explained why. To understand why his death still generates genuine scholarly debate, it helps to understand just how extraordinary his rise had been, and how strategically vital he had become to Han China at the moment he died. Qubing entered military service young, related by family connection to Wei Qing, another celebrated Han general, and to Empress Wei, consort of Emperor Wu. But whatever advantage this connection provided in opportunity, it did little to explain the scale of what followed. Beginning in his teenage years, Qubing distinguished himself in campaigns against the Xiongnu, the powerful nomadic confederation that had threatened Han China's northern and western frontiers for generations, using cavalry tactics notable for their speed, independence, and willingness to strike deep into Xiongnu territory rather than remaining tethered to more cautious defensive strategies favored by earlier Han commanders. By his early 20s, he had led campaigns that captured critical territory in the Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of land that would become essential to controlling trade and communication along what later generations would call the Silk Road, and had achieved a series of victories that historians generally regard as decisive in shifting the balance of the decades-long Han-Xiongnu conflict meaningfully in China's favor. Emperor Wu, whose reign is widely considered one of the most militarily aggressive and expansionist in early Chinese imperial history, appears to have regarded Qubing with a level of personal favor and strategic reliance that few generals of any era achieve. Historical accounts describe the emperor attempting to have an elaborate residence built for the young general, an offer Qubing reportedly declined, stating that as long as the Xiongnu remained undefeated, he had no interest in a home of his own, a line preserved in the records of the grand historian that has been quoted approvingly by Chinese military and political tradition for 2,000 years afterward as an example of selfless devotion to duty over personal comfort. And then, in 117 BC, at the height of this trajectory, Qubing died. The historical sources are, once again, strikingly thin on the specific cause, particularly given how significant a figure he was and how closely documented much of his military career had been up to that point. The records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han both record his death with minimal elaboration, offering little beyond the fact of it and the emperor's evident grief, which was considerable and well documented. Emperor Wu is described as personally arranging for troops from 5 border commands to form an honor guard along the funeral procession route, having the burial mound shaped deliberately to evoke Kilian Mountain in tribute to the general's greatest campaign, and expressing a depth of mourning that several historians have noted stands out even among the honors Han emperors typically extended to accomplished generals. This absence of documented cause has left considerable room for both mainstream historical explanation and more speculative theories, none of which can be verified with confidence given how little the primary sources actually say. The most widely accepted explanation among modern historians centers on disease, specifically the possibility that Qubing contracted an illness during his extensive campaigning across the harsh terrain of the Hexi Corridor and other frontier regions. Military campaigns of this era regularly expose soldiers and commanders alike to unfamiliar climates, contaminated water sources, and diseases against which their bodies may have had little natural resistance, and mortality from illness contracted during campaign, rather than from combat itself, was a persistent, well-documented reality throughout ancient Chinese military history. Under this reading, Qubing's death, however tragic given his age and evident promise, requires no unusual explanation at all, simply the ordinary, brutal risk faced by any commander who spent years leading troops through some of the most physically demanding terrain the Han Empire bordered. This explanation is plausible, consistent with known patterns of military mortality in this era, and accepted by most mainstream historians as the likely, if unverifiable, cause. But its very plausibility hasn't fully quieted a persistent undercurrent of alternative speculation, some rooted in genuine historical ambiguity, some closer to the fringes of historical interpretation. One thread of more speculative discussion centers on the complex political relationship between Qubing's family and the broader Han court, particularly involving his younger half-brother, Wang, who would go on to become one of the most powerful regents in Han history in the decades following Qubing's death, and whose own family would eventually be destroyed in a court purge generations later, accused of plotting against the throne. Some historians examining the broader arc of the Huo family's rise and eventual fall have wondered whether the seeds of later political conflict, court rivalries, jealousy over the extraordinary favor Emperor Wu showed the Huo family, might have existed even during Qubing's own lifetime, raising, without any direct textual evidence to support it, the speculative possibility that a young general who had accumulated this much personal glory and imperial favor at such a young age may have made enemies capable of hastening his death through means the historical record never documented, whether through poison or other more discreet methods available within a court already familiar, as we've seen throughout this series, with using exactly those tools against rivals who had grown too prominent, too quickly. It's worth being direct about the evidentiary weight of this theory. There is no specific historical source that names a suspect, describes a method, or provides any concrete accusation resembling the kind of documented suspicion Bangu was willing to record regarding Emperor Ping's death decades later. This remains, at most, informed speculation built on the broader pattern of Han court politics and the later well-documented downfall of Huoguang's own family, rather than anything resembling direct historical evidence pointing toward foul play in Qubing's specific case. A separate and in some ways more historically grounded line of inquiry involves the campaigns themselves, and the specific physical toll they may have taken beyond simple disease exposure. Qubing's military strategy relied heavily on rapid, deep incursions into unfamiliar territory, campaigns that pushed supply lines to their absolute limits and required extraordinary physical endurance from every soldier involved, the general included. Some historians have suggested that the cumulative physical strain of this style of warfare, sustained over several years of near-continuous campaigning beginning in his mid-teens, may have weakened his body considerably by his early 20s, regardless of whether a specific identifiable disease ultimately caused his death, making him more vulnerable to illness or injury that a less relentlessly active commander might have survived. There's also a smaller, stranger detail some later accounts associate with his final campaigns, describing unusual environmental conditions, extreme heat, difficult terrain, and limited water sources encountered during operations in the far northwest. Conditions that some modern historians studying historical epidemiology have connected to specific, identifiable disease risks common to that particular region and climate during this period. This remains, like much of this chapter, informed inference rather than documented certainty, an attempt to reconstruct plausible medical explanation from geographic and environmental context rather than direct textual evidence describing symptoms or diagnosis. What ultimately distinguishes Qubing's death from many of the more contested mysteries we've traced throughout this exploration isn't the presence of competing dramatic theories. It's the comparative absence of any theory at all within the earliest sources, a silence that, in this particular case, likely reflects something more mundane than deliberate concealment. Unlike the deaths of Qin Shi Huang or Emperor Ping, where later historians had clear political motivation to shape the narrative in specific directions, Qubing's death served no obvious later political purpose requiring embellishment or suppression. He died beloved, mourned publicly and extravagantly by an emperor who had every reason to want his death remembered as a tragedy rather than a scandal. If anything, this suggests the earliest chroniclers may simply have recorded what little they reliably knew, a sudden death of unclear cause, without embellishing it in either direction, leaving modern historians to reconstruct plausible explanation from circumstantial and medical context that the original sources never thought necessary to preserve. What remains, finally, at that mound near Maoling, shaped deliberately to echo a mountain range hundreds of kilometers away, is a monument built to honor a life whose end was never adequately explained, even by the very court that mourned it most visibly. Did Qubing die from a disease contracted during years of relentless campaigning across some of the harshest terrain the Han Empire touched, his body simply unable to sustain the pace that had made him legendary? Or does the extraordinary favor he received, the residence he refused, the Emperor's evident grief, the honor guard drawn from 5 border commands, suggest a young general who had risen high enough, fast enough, to have made enemies the historical record was never willing, or never able, to name? Somewhere beneath a mound shaped like a mountain he once fought beside, a general who reshaped the balance of an empire's greatest rivalry lies buried beside a question 2,000 years of Chinese historical scholarship has never definitively answered. Some deaths reshape an empire through absence, a throne left empty too suddenly, a conspiracy hidden too well. This one is unsettling for the opposite reason. Everyone around the dying man knew exactly what was happening and chose, for weeks, to do nothing at all. Picture a walled palace chamber in the state of Qi, sometime in the winter of 643 BC, its doors sealed from the outside, its windows deliberately blocked. Inside, an old man lies dying slowly, without food, without water, without a single attendant permitted to reach him. This was Duke Huan of Qi, widely regarded by later Confucian tradition as the first and most accomplished of the 5 hegemons, the powerful regional lords who, during the early centuries of the fractured Zhou dynasty we explored in the fall of King Yu, effectively held real political and military authority while nominally deferring to a Zhou king whose actual power had long since faded to ceremony. Duke Huan had spent over 4 decades building Qi into the most respected state in China, uniting rival lords under agreements he brokered rather than conquests he forced, celebrated across the classical tradition as a model of effective, if imperfect, statesmanship. And according to the records of the Grand Historian and several earlier sources, he died locked inside his own palace, abandoned by the very sons who should have inherited his legacy, his body reportedly left undiscovered for so long afterward that maggots were said to have crawled from beneath the sealed doors before anyone dared to open them. To understand how a ruler this accomplished met an end this horrifying, we have to look closely at the machinery of succession politics that Duke Huan himself had allowed to fester, quietly, for decades, right beneath the surface of his considerable achievements. Duke Huan's rise had depended enormously on one particular relationship. His chancellor, Guanzhong, widely regarded as one of the most brilliant statesmen in early Chinese history, credited with administrative, economic, and military reforms that transformed Qi from a capable state into the preeminent power of its era. The partnership between Duke and Chancellor is held up even today as a kind of ideal, a ruler wise enough to recognize genuine talent and give it the authority to govern effectively. But Guanzhong, aging alongside his lord, offered a final piece of counsel before his own death in 645 BC that Duke Huan, for reasons the historical record never fully clarifies, chose not to follow. According to tradition, Guanzhong warned the Duke specifically against 3 court favorites who had gained increasing personal influence over him in his later years. Yi Ya, a court chef reportedly so devoted to pleasing the Duke that he once cooked his own son to satisfy an offhand remark about never having tasted human flesh. Shu Diao, a eunuch who had reportedly castrated himself voluntarily to gain closer access to the inner palace and the Duke's trust. And Kai Feng, a prince from a neighboring state who had abandoned his own family and position to serve Duke Huan personally. Guanzhong argued that men willing to commit such extreme, unnatural acts of devotion, mutilating their own bodies, sacrificing their own children, abandoning their own families, revealed something deeply concerning about their true character, a willingness to violate the most basic human bonds, suggesting ambition dangerous enough that no amount of apparent loyalty should be trusted at face value. Duke Huan, according to the account, initially dismissed these three men from court following Guanzhong's advice. But within a short time, reportedly finding himself genuinely unhappy without their company, he recalled all three back to the palace, a decision the historical tradition treats as the fatal turning point of his entire reign, the one moment where wisdom accumulated over 4 decades of otherwise capable rule gave way to simple, human loneliness. This single decision set the stage for what followed. Duke Huan, like many rulers of this era, had fathered numerous sons through multiple wives and concubines, and had never definitively settled the question of succession with the clarity his own long, stable reign might have made possible. As his health began failing in his final years, this ambiguity became the opening that Yiya, Shudiao, and their allies at court needed. According to the records of the Grand Historian, the three favorites aligned themselves with a faction supporting one particular son's claim to succeed Duke Huan. And as the Duke's condition worsened, they moved to seize control of the palace itself, physically sealing him inside his own chambers, cutting off food, water, and all outside contact, ensuring that no rival faction could reach him, extract a final decree, or use his still living authority to challenge the succession the conspirators intended to install by force. What makes this account genuinely difficult to process, even within a series that has traced numerous political assassinations and calculated poisonings, is the sheer duration and deliberateness implied by the traditional narrative. This wasn't a swift act of violence. It was, according to the sources, a prolonged, silent siege waged against a single dying man by the very people closest to him, sustained specifically until nature completed what the conspirators themselves apparently preferred not to do directly. Some versions of the account describe a single attendant, a palace woman, who managed to briefly breach the sealed chambers near the very end, finding the Duke still alive but severely weakened, and hearing from him a final despairing acknowledgement that Guanjing's warning had been correct all along, that his own refusal to heed it had led directly to the abandonment now killing him. Whether this detail reflects a genuine final exchange, preserved through court memory and later recorded, or a later narrative embellishment added to sharpen the moral lesson of the story, trusting flattery over genuine counsel, is impossible to determine with certainty from sources compiled generations after the events they describe. Duke Huan's death, according to tradition, was followed by chaos precisely as severe as the sealed chamber implied. With his body reportedly left unattended for an extended period, sources describing it in graphic terms specifically meant to underscore the scale of the court's dysfunction. Qi descended into open succession warfare among his surviving sons, each backed by different factions within a court that had spent Duke Huan's final weeks consumed entirely by positioning rather than governance. The state that had spent 4 decades as the preeminent power of its era, brokering peace among rival lords and effectively holding the fractured Zhou political order together, spiraled into internal conflict severe enough that Qi's regional dominance never fully recovered, ceding its position as the leading hegemon to other states in the decades that followed. How much of this account reflects precise historical fact, and how much reflects the kind of moralized narrative construction we've encountered repeatedly throughout this series? This is a genuinely difficult question to answer with confidence, because unlike some of the deaths we've examined, where competing textual traditions offer directly conflicting versions, the broad outline of Duke Huan's death, abandonment by favored courtiers, a sealed chamber, a body left too long undiscovered, appears with reasonable consistency across multiple early sources, suggesting it was likely understood as broadly accurate within a few generations of the event itself. Even if specific details, the exact dialogue, the precise timeline, may have been sharpened over time into a more instructive shape. What's less certain is the deeper question of motive and character that the traditional narrative asks us to accept almost without question, that Yiya, Shudiao, and Kaifeng were, from the very beginning, calculating opportunists whose extreme acts of devotion had always concealed hidden ambition, exactly as Guanzhong had warned. This is a satisfying moral structure, foresight ignored, consequences delivered precisely as predicted. But it's also worth noting the exact kind of narrative shape that later Confucian historians, deeply invested in illustrating the dangers of flattery and the wisdom of principled counsel, had every reason to emphasize and preserve with particular care, regardless of how precisely it matched the more complicated, less morally tidy reality of what three specific individuals may have actually believed or intended in the final weeks of an aging ruler's life. There's also a broader, more unsettling possibility worth sitting with, one that doesn't require any of the three favorites to have been calculating villains from the start. Court politics in a state without a clearly settled succession tend to generate exactly this kind of crisis. Regardless of any individual's original character, ambitious factions coalescing rapidly around competing claims the moment a ruler's authority weakens. Loyalty and self-interest becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from each other, as a court realizes that whoever controls access to a dying lord effectively controls what happens next. Under this reading, Yiya and Shudiao may not have begun as villains secretly waiting for their moment. They may simply have been ordinary courtiers swept into extraordinary, ethically catastrophic circumstances the moment Duke Huan's failing health created a vacuum no clear succession plan had ever been established to fill. What remains, finally, is one of ancient China's starkest illustrations of how quickly accumulated wisdom can be undone by a single overlooked warning, and how completely a lifetime of accomplishment can be overshadowed by the manner of its ending. Duke Huan spent over 40 years building qi into the most respected power of his era, and is remembered even now almost as much for the horrifying isolation of his final weeks as for anything he achieved while he still held the strength to prevent it. Was his death the direct, foreseeable consequence of ignoring his most trusted advisor's final warning? Three men whose extreme devotion concealed ambition exactly as Guanzhong predicted? Or does the sealed chamber outside Lindsay represent something less about individual villainy and more about the universal fragility of power in any court that fails to settle who inherits it before the question becomes urgent? Three ordinary men transformed by circumstance and opportunity into the very thing an old man's dying warning had tried, and ultimately failed, to protect against. Duke Huan's court fell apart because too many people wanted control of a dying man's final word. What we turn to now is a different kind of disappearance entirely. Not a single ruler's final decree, but the accumulated written memory of an entire dynasty, vanishing not in one dramatic act, but through a slower, messier process that historians are still working to fully reconstruct. Picture the Stone Canal Pavilion, or Shikge, a library and archive complex within the Han Imperial Palace at Chang'an, its shelves holding what was, by the 1st century BC, one of the most extensive collections of governmental records, historical chronicles, and philosophical texts assembled anywhere in the ancient world. This was where scholars gathered under Han sponsorship to debate and standardize the surviving classical texts, where court historians drew source material for the great chronicles that would shape how later generations understood everything from the Yellow Emperor to the fall of the Qin. It represented, in a very real sense, the institutional memory of Chinese civilization up to that point, centuries of accumulated record, much of it painstakingly reconstructed after the burning of the Qin archives we examined earlier in this series, now gathered again under Han patronage into what should have been a far more secure, far more permanent foundation for historical knowledge. And yet a significant portion of what the Han dynasty collected across its 4 centuries of rule did not survive intact to reach us, and the story of how and when and how much was lost remains genuinely unresolved, pieced together from scattered references, bibliographic catalogs, and the frustrating gaps between what ancient sources claim once existed and what modern scholars have actually been able to recover. The most well-documented catastrophe struck at the very end of the Western Han period, during the chaos surrounding Wang Mang's fall that we've already traced in detail elsewhere in this series. When rebel forces, including the Red Eyebrows, stormed Chang'an in AD 23, contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe significant destruction across the palace complex, and by extension, considerable damage to the archives and libraries housed within it. This wasn't a targeted attack on knowledge itself. in the deliberate, ideologically motivated way the Qin burning is traditionally described. It was the more chaotic, incidental destruction that tends to accompany any capital falling to violent conquest. Fires spreading through palace structures, looting, and the simple, practical reality that a collection of bamboo strips and silk scrolls, however carefully preserved under stable conditions, does not survive well when the building housing it is burning. The scale of what was lost during this period is difficult to establish with precision, and this is where the mystery genuinely deepens rather than resolves. The Book of Han, compiled under the restored Eastern Han dynasty that followed, includes a bibliographic treatise, the Yuwenji, cataloging texts known to have existed within the Han Imperial collection, organized by category, philosophy, history, medicine, military strategy, divination, and more. This catalog represents an invaluable historical resource in its own right, but it also creates a persistent, quietly unsettling puzzle for later scholars. A considerable number of works listed in the Yuwenji simply do not survive today in any form, known only by title and brief description, their actual content lost entirely, presumably somewhere in the destruction and disorder surrounding Wang Mang's fall, though the historical record offers no precise account of exactly when, or how completely, each specific text disappeared. This is not, it's worth emphasizing, a mystery on the scale of the Qin burning, where a single deliberate imperial order provides at least a clear, if debated, point of origin for the destruction. The disappearance of significant portions of the Han archives appears to have been considerably more gradual and diffuse, unfolding across multiple episodes of political instability rather than one identifiable catastrophic event. The Eastern Han dynasty, re-established after Wang Mang's fall, worked to rebuild the imperial collection, and additional significant losses appear to have occurred again at the very end of the Han period, amid the collapse into the Three Kingdoms era, when Chang'an and later Luoyang, the Eastern Han capital, both experienced their own periods of warfare, occupation, and destruction. Historical accounts describe warlord Dongzhuo's forces during the chaotic final years of Han authority in the late 2nd century AD, causing extensive damage to Luoyang, including its palace complexes and, by most accounts, whatever portion of the imperial archives had been rebuilt there in the intervening generations since Wang Mang's fall. What makes this particular disappearance worth examining as its own distinct mystery, separate from the Qin burning we've already explored, isn't the scale of destruction alone, but the specific, frustrating nature of what we can and cannot reconstruct about it. We possess, thanks to the Yuwenji and later bibliographic catalogs, a reasonably detailed inventory of what once existed. What we lack is a clear, reliable account of the actual mechanism and timeline of loss, whether specific texts survived the fall of Chang'an only to be destroyed decades later at Luoyang, whether some material was deliberately targeted for destruction by specific factions during these periods of unrest, perhaps texts associated too closely with Wang Mang's discredited Qin dynasty, or portions of the historical record considered politically sensitive by whichever faction happened to control the capital at a given moment, or whether the losses were simply the incidental, unplanned casualty of repeated military occupation, indifferent to the specific content being destroyed. This distinction matters considerably for how we understand the broader shape of Chinese historical memory. If losses during this period were primarily incidental, the unavoidable casualty of a capital repeatedly caught in the path of warfare, then what survived likely represents something close to a random sample of the original collection, shaped by chance rather than deliberate selection. But some historians have raised a more pointed question. Did specific factions, at various points during this extended period of instability, have particular incentive to ensure certain texts didn't survive? Historical accounts too favorable to a discredited faction, philosophical or political writings that challenged whatever narrative the currently dominant power wished to establish. We've already seen, throughout this series, repeated examples of Chinese historians writing generations after contested events, shaped by the political needs of whichever dynasty commissioned their work. It's a reasonable, if largely unprovable, question to ask whether the survival of specific texts through this chaotic period may have been influenced by similar political calculation, rather than simple chance. with some material perhaps deliberately allowed to be lost because its survival would have complicated the historical narrative the eventual victors wished future generations to inherit. There's a specific category of loss within this broader disappearance that has drawn particular scholarly attention. Works of history and political commentary that later bibliographic sources indicate once existed, offering perspectives or accounts that appear, based on their catalog descriptions, to have diverged meaningfully from the versions of events that did survive, particularly the records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han, both of which we've relied on extensively throughout this exploration precisely because they represent, in many cases, essentially the only surviving detailed account of the events they describe. If alternative histories once existed, offering different perspectives on figures like Wang Mang, or different interpretations of contested successions like Fusu's death or Emperor Ai's sudden decline, their loss means that modern historians attempting to evaluate these mysteries are frequently working with what amounts to a single surviving primary account, rather than the kind of multiple cross-reference sources that would allow genuine independent verification. This is, in a sense, the quiet mechanism underlying much of the uncertainty we've encountered throughout this entire series, not necessarily because Sima Qian or Bangu were unreliable narrators, but because the alternative accounts that might have allowed us to check their work against independent testimony appear to have been among the casualties of exactly the archival losses this chapter is attempting to trace. Modern archaeology has occasionally offered fragments of correction to this otherwise frustrating gap. Discoveries of Han period bamboo and silk texts, recovered from tombs, and, in a few remarkable cases, from dry wells and abandoned administrative sites along the western frontier, preserved by climate and burial conditions that the palace archives themselves, vulnerable to fire and looting, never enjoyed. These discoveries have occasionally included texts or portions of texts that had been presumed entirely lost, offering brief, tantalizing glimpses of exactly the kind of alternative material the Yuwenji catalog suggests once existed in far greater quantity. Each such discovery raises the same quiet, persistent question that runs beneath this entire chapter. How much more might still be out there, buried in conditions that happen to preserve it, waiting for the right excavation, the right archaeologist, the right stretch of undisturbed earth to bring some fragment of the Han Dynasty's lost historical memory back into the record after 2,000 years of presumed permanent absence? What remains, finally, is a disappearance shaped less by a single dramatic decision than by the accumulated, repeated vulnerability of physical records to the ordinary chaos of dynastic collapse. Fires spreading through palace complexes, not because anyone specifically wanted certain knowledge destroyed, but because armies and libraries have never coexisted well across any civilization at any point in history. And yet the specific texts we know we lost, named in a catalog but represented today by nothing more than a title and a brief description, leave behind a particular kind of absence that's different from simple, anonymous destruction. We know precisely what's missing. We simply cannot know what it said, or how differently we might understand figures like Wang Mang, or Emperor Ai, or the true circumstances surrounding Han Xin's death, had those specific accounts managed to survive the fires that took Chang'an and later Luoyang, instead of the versions that happened, by whatever combination of chance and calculation, to make it through. Did the Han archives disappear simply because two capitals, decades apart, had the misfortune of falling to conquest at moments when their libraries stood in the path of the resulting destruction? Or did specific factions at specific moments across this extended period of instability have quiet reasons to ensure that certain historical accounts never survived to challenge the narratives their successors would go on to establish? Somewhere between the Yuwenji's careful catalog of what once existed and the fragments modern archaeology has occasionally recovered from wells and tombs the fires never reached, an unknown portion of how the Han Dynasty understood its own history remains exactly where so much of this series keeps returning us, present enough in outline to know precisely what we're missing, and lost thoroughly enough that no one alive can say with certainty whether that loss was simply misfortune or something closer to design.